Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If Guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the third part of What If Issei was a part of a great war. Now before starting, please give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. 417 M42 Terra Sol System. The skies of Terra burned. The wreckage of tens of thousands of ships littered the upper atmosphere of the home world, raining down the hardened metals of the once mighty fleets of mankind onto the Ecumenopolis that was the cradle of humanity. But the heated metal shards were not the only things falling onto the planet. The bodies of the planet's defenders fell planet-side by the tens of millions out of the void ships that continued to rain death onto the planet's remaining inhabitants. It had been a hopeless situation for the remaining rulers of mankind's once galaxy-spanning empire. The defeat of the green tide of the Octarius sector had signaled the first death note of the song that had doomed the species of the galaxy. The song rose its discordant notes every time another sector fell to the swarm. Its people, animals, plants down to the very microorganisms turned into the material of war that continued unabated through the galaxy. From multiple directions this threat came, one from the galactic east, one from the galactic south and west, and finally from beneath the galactic plane itself. The swarm marched on undaunted and unstoppable, a mouth ready to devour all biomass it could find, leaving nothing but barren and dead worlds in its wake. The song was reaching its end now as the hive mind made its final move against the last bastion of the Imperium of Man. The Imperial defenders fought to the bitter end, destroying bioship after bioship, but the swarm kept advancing, absorbing the dead husks of their fallen ships, returning biomass to the hive fleets that surrounded Terra. But Terra's ills continued to mount as two colossal objects entered the planet's atmosphere, drifting to places that people in the far distant past would refer to as Africa and South America. The first of the continent killers was the remains of a once proud world that had produced a knight of legend, one of the master of mankind's sons, a returned Primarch. The remnants of the First Legion had rushed to Terra with their many successor chapters, the Lion being forced to choose between one of the few other remaining systems that Terra had contact with in the throne world. So it had been with a heart long beset with grief that the First came, bringing with them a large number of surviving militarum regiments and ships from many near-destroyed sector fleets. The Astartes, regiments, and void ships had bought Terra only a small sliver of time, though it had been much less than what had been projected by the Lord Commander, sending the morale of the remaining defenders further into the ground in the outer reaches of the Sol system, selling their lives on Pluto and Neptune, allowing the priests of Mars to build more defense systems around Mars, Luna, and Terra, along with the time for repairs to be made to the battered forces of the Imperial Navy representing the battered vessels of Battle Fleet Solar. Those efforts had been for naught. The rock descended through the atmosphere, pulled by the planet's gravity ever downward, and in the blink of an eye the asteroid slammed into the city's surface. Untold billions disappeared in an instant, and the planet's surface shook down to its very core, sending metal shards up into the upper atmosphere and into the void. The second sphere of metal, a massive Gothic fortress containing the legacy of its Astartes and their father, dropped unceremoniously onto what was the central hive of Rios, taking more of the dirty masses of humanity screaming into the warp as they disintegrated from the heat wave that spat out from both landing sites. The downward spiral continued when the first mycetic spores started falling from the sky and landing in the devastated zones. 425 M42 Terra Imperial Palace. The corpses of the swarm were stacked as high as the once beautifully grandiose walls of the outer palace of the Emperor of Mankind. No part was left unstained by the teeth, claws, and poisonous munitions the swarm wielded as a part of their disgusting chitinous body. The fight was hopeless, yet the forces remaining to the master of mankind fought from the remnants of the proud militarum regiments from over 100 destroyed worlds, fighting onwards with not one step back willingly, and when forced out of a courtyard or hall, fighting until their swords, knives, or even the ever-humble shove wore out to the point of uselessness before using the last of their grenades to slam into the swarm and detonate the corpses of the fallen to deny the swarm their meal. To the unwavering and ever-faithful sororitas of the ecclesiarchy, raining holy fire on the swarm from their flamers and meltas, purging the foul Xenos that dared to defile holy Terra. Every death from their ranks was a new martyr, fueling the zeal of the sea's warrior women to ever greater heights. The noble and ancient Astartes chapters, whose numbers were now so greatly reduced that the Lord Commander had countermanded his own multi-millennial work and ordered those remnants chapters to form up on their primogenitor namesakes and reform, however briefly, the legions to simplify command and control of the Imperium's mass-produced transhumans. Old rivalries now lay dead and rotted among the loyal angels of death as they fought with every single technique and weapon dragged from their very long and storied service to the Emperor, every marine fighting until their twin hearts failed, their corpses surrounded by many more bodies than the normal and augment baseline humans could believe, leading charges that would retake fallen strong points for continual Imperial use for hours and sometimes days at a time. Fighting often at the back of the legions were the few yet unbowed tech priests of Mars, who had kept the manufactoriums of the palace churning out the material of war for as long as possible. The priesthood of Mars' few remaining Scuderii manipules were assisting the other forces of the Imperium with the now beyond rare and pricelessly valuable weapons of war such as the radium carbine that would cause the vanquished enemy to spill deadly radiation onto its surrounding comrades, the plasma guns that continued to score kills against the creatures of the swarm, and the now hopelessly reduced Titans and Knights who would destroy whole sections of the always increasing swarm, off winning precious gasps of long overdue rest to its weary defenders. And finally, there were the golden walking behemoths that were the golden-clad heralds of the master of mankind. The awe-inspiring custodians were whenever found by the forces of the Imperium would witness the devastation of the custodies as they would hold strong points in the palace with just a single member of their immortal brotherhood never falling back until even. They would be finally overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the swarm and the incredibly disheartening ever-increasing number of specialized bioforms that would choke the halls of the palace. It had been an ever-slow retreat for the forces of the Imperium. Halls and strong points in the continent-spanning palace made in ancient times by the Praetorian of Terra, the famed master builder, fell slowly one by one in an ever-growing sign of the despair that was building in the hearts of the palace's defenders. Now 7 solar years after the first spores landed on Terra, the swarm was at the gold-clad gates of the innermost sanctum of the palace. Eternity Gate, the massive hallway leading to the gate which had held on its crack, it held the last memories of near 5 million standards of the proud Astra Militarum regiments who had earned the utmost honor of being on those hallowed walls for their devotion to the master of mankind. Those flags now lay on the floor of the hall, toxin holes littering their synth cloth, with no way to even tell what home world the regiment had come from, erasing human memory those who had come before. The remaining defenders had established a defensive line that held back the swarm. Even now the remaining Titans continue laying down fire upon the swarm at the far end of the hall, with artillery from the Militarum and Soroid is joining in the song of death that continued to play, signaling the death of a species. 427 M42 Terra, Imperial Palace, seat of the Golden Throne. The singing in the room was intolerable. It was non-stop, building in its crescendo, the disturbing singing rising from the 1,000 pods that held the power sources for the greatest technological monstrosity that humanity had ever forged. The Golden Throne, the singular thing that kept the master of mankind alive and able to do the necessary task of keeping the astronomican running for the ships of the species to continue their track through the hellscape that was the warp. The power sources were 1,000 human psychers that were trapped inside the pods, each connected to the throne, feeding their life essence to him, continuing a tradition that was established in the now mythological days of the Great Heresy 10,000 years. 1,000 psychers a day that had been the horrific price humanity had willingly paid to keep the Imperium going. The singing of the psychers always made Robouts Gilliman incredibly uneasy. The Lord Commander and Regent of the Imperium continued to count as each shot from the Titans and the artillery rang out its song. He quickly made a mental note that the weapon crews were being extra conservative today with the ordnance, something he had not mentioned to his subordinates that it all take a single unconscious thought, while his eyes remained on the many giant screen layouts where all the information about the assault of the swarm, the data coming from the few sensor servo skulls that remained hidden in the palace. Another screen held information for the casualty rate of the remaining Imperial forces, which forces needing what valuable war material and or which needed precious reinforcements. He would have to speak with the commanders and tell them to step up the bombardment and not be stingy. The singing was getting louder and more colorful, which was the signal to the surviving adepts that psychers were getting ready to expire, which would mean that more would be needed to be inserted into the pods. Thank Terra that there was massive room hidden near the throne that solely contained the cryostatus forms of the Imperium psychers specify used for this task. Another note was made by the Primarch to have a census of the remaining stock taken in an hour by one of his seneschals to make sure that there was enough power for the hungering monstrosity of a throne. A third screen pinged with a message from the tech adept saying that another of the palace's forges had actually surpassed the production quotas for the day, a rare but welcome surprise that made a small hint of a smile cross the regent's face. The fourth screen pinged a moment later, informing that another stronghold on Terra was about to be overwhelmed by the swarm. He checked the item tag for the message. It was from the fabled Terran Military Academy located in the massive hive city located in Frank. Issei involuntarily made it past the Primarch's lips. The mood was now ruined. A fifth screen ping reported that the Captain General of the Custodes had repealed another burrowing attempt that the swarm had initiated 2 hours ago. And the casualty report was not the worst the Regent had seen so far today: 24 Militarum troopers and a single squad of Sisters of Battle. Regrettably, the worst part of the report was the loss of the Sister Superior, who had survived most of the siege and was well versed in fighting in the bowels of the palace. What was her name again? It was Giselle. His mind supplied after a millisecond. It was a terrible loss, one he would have to report to Celestine, who would no doubt be saddened to hear of their passing. There were too few truly reasonable warriors from the orders of those fanatics, a true loss. A sixth screen ping was now focused on, and it was a simple message sent personally to him through the noosphere. Brother, I require your attention at your earliest convenience. Hilliman tabbed out of the data feed and began to sit up from the cogitator throne, feeling the muscles in his transhuman body ache for a moment before they returned to their normal readiness. He gestured over to a servitor to catalog the reports for the next half hour and slowly moved out of the throne room. A last glance over his shoulder saw the end of the psychic song from the batteries finally giving out, the song plateauing into an uncomfortable silence which would be restarted again in an hour. That meant that the Imperium had for now seen the light of another solar day. Lionel Johnson, Master of the Order, Lion of Caliban, the First. The almost War Master sat quietly meditating in a storage room that had once contained numerous scrolls of the far distant past, though few of them now remained in a barely readable condition where even a hint of the now long dead languages. It had been an off-chance discovery for the Lion made in the months leading up to the current time. A flicker of an echo of psychic energy had caught the Lion's attention, for all the sons of the Emperor contained within them hints of their creator's psychic might. Some, like the Angel, the Cyclops, and the Night Haunter, had received significant portions of it. Others, like Lion, would only get the ghost of a sensation every now and then. Lion had been in the room for 15 minutes now, remembering the past and the sins he had committed against both the regular humans he had been tasked with to help save from the terrors of old night, and the sins committed against his own sons. How he longed to go back and speak to his adopted father Luther once more, to throw himself at his feet and hang his head in uncourtly shame for both his actions during the great crusade which had led to the ostracism of Luther and half his legion, to depart from the crusade back to Caliban and their showdown on the dying world that they both had called home. He had forgiven Luther and those who had followed him long ago, but he still wished for their verbal forgiveness. Luther had redeemed himself in the end. He was the reason a large chunk of the Lion and a great many of the Unforgiven's successor chapters, their militarum, hangers-ons, and many hundreds of ships had reached Terra half a year before the swarm had arrived, Luther having sacrificed his fleet to delay the swarm over a gas giant in the Korakin system. The sound of footsteps coming from armored feet interrupted these thoughts, and Gilliman entered the room. The first looked up to the face of the 13th. Lion had been dismayed by how young his brother had looked upon their reunion. The ravages of time were nowhere to be seen on his transhuman face at the time. Now Gulliman had aged rapidly as the Imperium had crumbled. His hair, once a glorious blonde, now had nearly as many specks of gray as Lion's own. The worry lines were deep and numerous. His eyes held the weight of the Imperium's worries in his blue eyes. Lion thought that he probably had a similar look in his own gray eyes. "Brother, what is it you require?" Lion paused for a brief second, considering how he wanted to breach the topic that had been suppressed for far too long. "Brother, Eternity Gate has held for the night." Robot merely shrugged. "The gate has held. Was that doubt I hear in your voice?" Lion shook his head. "No, brother, 'twas not doubt I am voicing. Rather it would be to ask if our nightmare is over." Robot's frown was now longer than before. "I never thought I would hear of the day that Lionel Johnson thought that you would turn into a defeatist, brother." Lion's own face had joined his brother's own. "Not defeatism. No, I ask because even with my own strategic mind, I see no way out of this fight in any way that does not lead to our final damnation. When was the last time we heard from a planet that was not from within the confines of Sol?" Robot did not meet the Lion eyes, not willing to answer, for that was the beginning of the path of true hopelessness. However, the silence was all the answer that they both knew needed to be voiced at some point. Truly, it was 3 months before the swarm arrived in Sol, brother. Robot's face truly showed the pain of that admission. Something imperceptible changed in the fetid air that had been recycled hundreds of millions of times that the two breathed. The silence continued for but a moment before Lion acknowledged that confession. "Then you can see, brother, why I have come to ask that question. We can never go on the offensive. We cannot retake many, if any, strong points. Our numbers continue to dwindle along with our munitions stockpiles. We can't succeed, brother." Robot fired back in righteous anger that was not uncommon for him nowadays. The burden of being surrounded by those who had placed him on a pedestal of a saint-like point had worn down the once calm and collected person he had been. "Mayhaps if we had more of our brothers and their legions, what would it change? We might last for a few more years at worst, and a decade at best. It grows closer to the end, brother, as much as it pains me to admit that. Our dream is dead and gone. Just like father, I now try to think of what we can do with the remaining time that we have been afforded with. To try and consider which can be fixed, even if it is the slightest of chances." Robot face shadowed the discomfort that he felt welling up in his humors. "Fabricator General Call still has plans, brother. Yes, many of them are outlandish and mayhaps touched with a bit of his eccentricities, but your pet tech priest's plans are of the impractical more often than not, and even you cannot turn his theocraticals into practicals. Nothing will change, brother. Was not his latest scheme to dig deeper into the crust of Terra and hide a gene vault with the remaining genetic stock of our current defenders, and hope against hope that the swarm does not find it? Was it not another of these schemes of his that brought more of the swarm to Sol when at the time we had contained them to the furthest reaches of the system?" Robot grimaced at that question. It was true that the plan Call had enacted had cost the Imperium dearly that day. Only he, the Lion, Celestine, Call, and the High Lords had known the results of that plan, and it would be another secret that he would take to his grave. "I would say, Robot, that I would rather the traitors return in full force to Terra than ever even consider another of Call's plans. They have cost us enough time, resources, and manpower that could have helped us last for longer. In truth, Robot, you know we would have been destroyed 100 times over here if Ultramar still stood and you had not been able to be here." That comment hurt Robot more than he cared to admit. A vision of Macragge appeared in the 13th's mind's eye, a world of unequaled beauty for those who had hailed from it. Its hive cities had been some of the most fully functional and well kept in the Imperium, another mark of pride for those who had called it home. It had been a world that had somehow managed to keep most of its ecology intact throughout the many millennia, and it was well mourned by all the sons of Robout. Lion noticed the silence that his comment had stirred in his brother's heart. Where once during the crusade the lion had been an emotionless rock of a man sometimes compared to Rogel and his less than stellar Montanato range, now Lion saw the pain he had instilled in his brother. "I am sorry for what I said. I am still not truly used to." Robout shook off the words, and but a moment after the words left his brother's mouth. It is all right, Lion. I know that you are trying. I see the true meaning of your words. In a small voice that Robout would never let his sons or those outside of his most trusted brothers. "I just miss home. I miss them." Those words struck Lion, for he knew who they were. Their brothers, both those who had stayed loyal to their father's dream and those who had turned their back on the light of the crusade. In Robout's adoptive family, his father Connor and his mother in all but name. Lion rose from his meditation position and put a hand on his brother's shoulder in a sign of support. "I understand, brother. I understand." It was a quiet moment that many would have doubted would ever have occurred given the history of the two, but here it was happening, though few would ever know or see that this happened. The moment passed when a data slate hooked to the 13th bell chimed. The Lord Regent removed the magnetized slate and peered at the message. "Duty calls, brother, as it always does. I will continue this discussion with you the next moment that you are free, brother. Please look after yourself. You look like you have not had decent sleep in years." Robout paused as he had been moving towards the door to the office space. "I have not. Hard to with everything at stake." Lion nodded. "Try to sleep for a bit sometime this cycle, brother. I'll take charge of the defenses. I might not be the master logistician you are, but I am sure I would not be too awful at it." The ghost of a smile crossed Robout's face. "Here, I thought I'd never see the day that you would make such a terrible joke, brother." Lion smiled himself. "This is an age of the unknown, brother, most of it for ill, but some buried in all the muck, grime, and shit in this still rotting corpse of an empire is perhaps something of a wonder. Becoming a philosopher, are we? Mayhaps, brother, mayhaps." 431 M42 Terra Throne Room. The throne hummed and creaked with exertion as the current batch of psychers continued the song. The music could be heard in the rooms surrounding the throne room, and it always left a disturbing impression on both the transhumans and the baselines. The room that the remnants of the once most powerful officials of the known human galaxy had been reduced to using. Robout sat at the head of the circular table, a commandeered throne that had yet to be melted down to make munitions for the Imperial defenders held the Regent of Terra. To his right sat Lionel Johnson, looking over the others seated at the table with a hawk-like certainty. On his right sat the Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum, a young woman who had once been one of the millions of refugees that had flooded the Imperial Palace as the swarm continued its march. Her hair was a dirty black short hair done up in a style that was once a staple of the lower classes of Terra's underhives, was contained in a rough commissar's peak cap. Her clothing was also roughly made from the reused cloth from some probably long-ignored room in the palace. To her right sat the ever-devoted and patient living Saint Celestine. Her eyes, however, showed a woman who was dragged down to the lowest of lows, more so than the Lord Regent in the night. Next to her was the chosen speaker for the remainder of the Astartes. The first captain from the White Scars is one of the now incredibly rare firstborn Marines. The captain's face was set into a slight scowl, his brown eyes looking at the remainder of the baseline humans with the disdain that was typical of the transhuman warriors. The next individual was the Captain General of the 10,000 Trajan Valorous, his face also set into a more deepened scowl. His golden Baroque armor had countless scratches from claws, dents from biomunitions, and the general wear and tear of armor that had little time with the repair servitors. The final two members of the much-reduced High Lords of Terra were the Fabricator General Belisarius, called currently in a much smaller body than previous models, his blood-red robes covering the many Mechidonrites that snaked thereout from his elongated back. He was the only member of the Lords with what could be called a positive expression on the bare hints of a mortal face that peered around the respirator attached to his mouth. Finally, was the master of the Astra Telepathica, the adeptor responsible for the keeping the Golden Throne supplied with its grim vessels. It was he that spoke, starting the daily meeting. "Lord Regent, after the latest census of the stock, I regret to inform you that we are nearing the bottom of our supply of psychers. Unless we get more from within our current population, the throne will not have the needed stock to continue functioning." The shock that statement should have generated did not manifest itself in the rest of the High Lords. They had long been aware that the current supply of psychers was dwindling, and it seemed that the despair that had permeated through all ranks of the defenders had now reached a new all-time low. Robout asked the question, "How much longer will our current supply last, Lord Telepath?" "My Lord Regent, we have enough psychers in cold storage that we can supply the throne for another 3 days, for if we sacrifice the rest of osteopathic choirs." It was the Astartes that spoke before the Regent. "My lord, I recommend that we immediately gather up the choirs and get them ready for processing. It's not like they serve any other purpose now that we no longer receive communications from outside Sol. They are drained on resources, and with their liquidation we can use the rooms that they occupy to give more of our battle line warriors a chance of rest." It was a typical response from a logistician's point of view. It would free up more resources besides rooms. The cloth of their robes could make more bandages, the metal of the rooms could make more shells for the artillery pieces that survived thus far into the siege, and the excess food that the choirs had consumed would go to the soldiers and warriors. It was cold hard pragmatism. Celestine spoke up, showing that she still maintained some of the humanity that many of the defenders had long since abandoned, even more so than before. I object to this plan, my lord. What if by implementing this we miss a communication that could signal? The Captain General rudely interrupted her. The Astarte is correct in their assessment of the situation, Saint. The barely concealed disgust for the woman who had become all but a name leader of the ecclesiarchy showed on his near-perfect face. The choirs have taken up too many resources that could have been used earlier in the siege. Maybe that would have given us the slightest edge to have. You know in your heart, Captain General, that it would have made little difference if we had done that. It was rare for the living saint to raise their voice above that of a normal conversational tone. The bite in her normally good-natured voice showed her own very well-hidden disdain. We should consider the souls of the sea psychers. They have been loyal servants of the God Emperor, and their dignity should be respected. The fire and clear zeal in her voice showed why the remaining faithful of the Imperium flocked to her sermons, both on the field of battle and off the field in the makeshift chapels that were constructed in the numerous rooms that were spaced around the throne room that spiritually fed the defenders. The two transhuman representatives who were not Primarchs did not look impressed at the display from the living saint. The Astartes and the 10,000 were very rarely in agreement on pretty much anything. The multi-millennium of mistrust between the two Adeptus had made sure of that. The order should be implemented immediately, Lord Regent. I can spare a couple of my warriors to your command, and we can process these filthy mutants quickly, and perhaps we can. Lord Regent, The table descended into a fierce argument about the course they should take, with neither the transhumans nor the saint backing down from their positions. Hall looked on amused while the Lord Commander of the Guard looked away from the storm that had been unleashed. The Master of the Telepathica did not contribute to either side, though it was obvious that he was inclining in agreement with the 10,000 and the Astartes. Enough, the voice of the Master of Macreg snapped. The strength of the rage in his voice intimidated the guard commander into a shivering mess, while the Astarte and the custodian merely shook ever so slightly, not in fearful. They had been gene-crafted and biologically made to know no fear, but in deference for the Primarch and his father, the Emperor, beloved by all. Celestine merely bowed her head in submission, her normally pale face still flustered with clear anger. The silence that the voice had brought hung heavy in the air. Enough. We have enemies at our gate, and instead of turning our fury on them, we turn it on each other. The words Lion had uttered 6 years ago came to the forefront of Robout's mind. Our dream is dead and gone, just like father. What use was there now to resist the death of this ever-lingering nightmare that had been his reality for the past 400 years? Another day was nothing to the cold hard end that was approaching them. The abyss of extinction that he and his brothers had fought so hard against during the Great Crusade. The abyss that had been so close to finishing off the dream when Cadia had fallen, and the Great Rift had sundered the galaxy in two. What was there left to lose? There was no hope left for any species left in the Milky Way. The Tau had been swallowed whole by the swarm in less than a decade. The Eldari had scattered to the four corners of the galaxy, desperate to keep their race from the same abyss. The last he had heard from Ivrain was shortly before the shadow in the warp had completely cut off communications for Saul. Next to nothing was known about the Greenskins, and only the barest hints of rumors had been heard of for the Necrons. The traitors had not been seen in large numbers at all since shortly after Lion had made his first communication to Robout. The swarm had pushed just as hard against them as they had against the Imperium. The last confirmed sighting of any organized traitor army or naval presences had been before all communication from Imperium Nihilus had completely shut down and stopped just weeks after Lion had crossed the Nachman Gauntlet trying to get to Imperium Sanctus. The many tens of thousands of hidden cults dedicated to the ruinous powers had caused significant trouble for the retreating Imperial forces, hampering the withdrawal of tens of thousands of regiments of the Militarum and the ever-desperately needed naval assets that had been locked down fighting the cult's many uprisings, holding them in place often enough for the swarm to come in and slaughter wholesale the forces of the Imperium and the cults themselves. The words he had uttered on Ultramar in the Temple of Hera after his resurrection had always haunted him. Why do I still live? What more do you want from me? I gave everything I had to you, to them. Look what they have made of our dream. This bloated, rotting carcass of an empire is driven not by reason and hope but by fear, hate, and ignorance. Better we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than to live to see this. Our dream is dead, just like father. The Lord Regent looked to the still silent room. Leave me. I will pass a decision in an hour. I must consider the options. The order was given. Yes, Lord Regent. All the members of the High Lords responded. They got up from their chairs, some more gracefully than others. They moved to the door to the room with haste. All except Lion. The first stood still in his place to Robout, right unmoving, with a face that spoke nothing of his own thoughts. Lion, I won't leave, brother. The unsaid words of support for whatever decision that Robout would make calmed the Primarch. Thank you, brother. The two of them sat in silence for a moment before Robout spoke, his voice no longer containing his anger and frustration. They are right. Who are right, the Captain General or the Saint? A pause. They both are right. For different reasons, but both are still right. Lion looked at his brother. They are, he agreed. But what side of the throne do you fall on, brother? The warrior in me sides with the Captain General. The human in me with Celestine, though I wonder why she is so fierce in her protection of the mutants. Her religious creed decries their very existence. Mayhaps it's because she too can see our end and wishes to preserve her dignity. Possible, but unlikely. The decision means nothing in the end. You were right 6 years ago, brother. The dream is truly and utterly dead. The last of those words were spoken in a whisper. Lion was about to open his mouth when a sudden drop in temperature hit them in full force. Both Primarchs jerked upwards, going for their swords. When another voice, one that had not been heard by one for 400 years for one and for 10,000 years by the other. The dream has truly been dead for a long time, my sons. The two Primarchs looked forward to where the shadows that engulfed the room were strongest, and out of the shadows stepped a pale, translucent figure. He was at glance an ordinary man, one you could look at and see on every hive world that the Imperium had possessed and not spared a second thought of. The next moment he was a mighty warlord of the long bygone ages of Terra's long and storied past, dressed in mighty armor, some so ancient and strange-looking that it would look downright primitive for those of the far future. Father, Lion breathed, letting out a long breath he had not known he had been holding in. Robout, however, did not look impressed or taken back by the display, simply asking with frustration leaking back into his voice, "What aspect are we conversing with?" The figure seemed to shift its form, uncomfortable for a few more moments before answering. Regret. The specter moved more out of the shadows so that the light fully illuminated it. Regret. Robout echoed the answer. The last time we spoke you didn't seem to have any regrets, father. The words were spat with such anger, hatred, and resentment that they surprised Lion. Instead of looking at his creations fully, the specter appeared to be looking directly at the wall behind them. Yes, regret. The words seemed to hurt the specter physically. There are many things that I have looked back on over the millennium and I regret not doing the correct thing. Such as when we last conversed with each other. You made yourself and your opinions on us and our situation truly clear the last time we spoke, father. We were just lab rats to you. All of us, we were designed to fulfill just our purpose and to never question you in any way, shape, or form. We were to be things that were not our own selves. No free will, no real choices that were our own. The anger and rage spilling from Robout was beyond the point of even Mortarian's bitterness. The words the 13th spat at his creator, father, were filled with the resentment that the Primarch had felt for those past 4 centuries. The Shade took the words, snarled at him with surprising dignity. Once Robout's rant had ended, the specter of the Emperor of mankind, beloved by all, the Emperor accepted the rightly accused abuse without a word. When the rage had been spent and no more word flowed from the Lord Regent's lips, only then did the Master of Mankind speak. You are right. A pause before the Shade continued. The Shade was quiet for a moment before it spoke again. This time it was full of many somber emotions. I did say those things. That is without question. However, the delivery of said answers left a nugget of regret that has over the last 4 centuries hardened and grown from the scattered remnants of my psyche leading to my creation. I, as you know, am but an aspect of him, and I speak the truth when I truly say I am the aspect of regret. I was so certain of myself and my vision of what our species should be that I never sat and considered what effects would be spawned from my many careless actions. Yes, I was on a time limit that was nearing the unavoidable during the Crusade. But it is not an excuse for actions that led to this end we now face. I deeply regret what was said, my son. The Shade looked into the eyes of the avenging sun, and Robout could see that the words the aspect had spoken were indeed spoken in a moment of unfiltered truth. I cannot forgive you, Shade. Your actions are many and monstrous, they reek of the inhumane. We look to you, many of us, with genuine affection and admiration. You spat on that affection too many times to count in actions both big and small. I can forgive many things and people, even that warped spawn of a fanatic lorger, but you I cannot forgive. The aspect merely seemed to take the verbal hits, not showing any emotions on its face. It was after a few moments that the Shade spoke. I understand and accept that, son. I am here to tell you both that you do not have to worry much longer about the end and the death. The plan has been chosen and the pieces are set ready for the moment to be unleashed. Do not be worried. The Shade paused before continuing. Make the right choice, my son. The one that we all should have made many times over. The translucent figure began to fade from the Primarch's vision, but the face of the Shade looked again at his sons before bowing his head and disappearing for sight. The room would be silent for the remainder of the hour. When the Lord Regent recalled the High Lords, they entered the room with faces made of stone. When the Lord Regent gave his order, it was in support of Celestine, and it was followed without question by the transhumans. The look that Trajan gave was pointed, and his eyes showed his disappointment with the 13th. The living saint, instead of gloating or any other behavior that would have been seen in any human, instead gave the smallest of smiles to the Lord Regent. Call looked on, still amused with the whole exchange. The Master of the Telepathica and the Lord Commander Militant did not show their thoughts. It was an unceremonious end to another long and painful day. The next 2 days saw as many of the faithful as could be spared from the front line before Eternity Gate. Both the many common soldiers and from the few Astartes that had embraced the imperial cult flooded the makeshift chapels, praying in all-consuming silence to the God Emperor for any number of reasons. Forgiveness for sins and failures committed in their lives, to the wish to be reunited with their fallen loved ones or honored comrades or battle brothers. The remaining Marines, in an unexpected move, gathered in a large amphitheater and took on an old and storied tradition that had been created in the days of the Crusade. An oath of moment, a solemn oath that summed up the feelings of all those who were present at the moment of its creation. Instead of the anger, bitterness, and hopelessness that one would expect, the Marines had in a brief spark of light that belied the fact the Marines that were present, predominantly Primaris with an occasional firstborn, had come from many extremely different gene lines, lineages, and cultures that had been a strength of the Imperium made this oath of moment out to their many fallen comrades. The storied histories of their many chapters, the honor that they had fought, killed, and in some cases such as those stuck in the few dreadnoughts remaining died for. It was a sight that had humbled the few baseline humans that saw it and had even moved some in the 10,000, if only the hint of a second. The two Primarchs watched as the moment came to its end, and the Marines, as they left the theater, they bowed lower than was normal for an estates to two of the sons of their grandfather. The small numbers of the Adeptus Mechanicus had sequestered themselves into one of the manufactiums that continued to spit out munitions and basic weapons and armor repairs to the Imperial Defenders' wargear. And a haunting hymn had been sung in Binaric to the few cogitators and pieces of technology left to them. Like the Marines, the Tech Adepts had been from many different forge worlds, so the hymn had carried many strange and confusing pieces, reminders of that history that was now lost to the darkness of the abyss. The only one of the priesthood of Mars that had not been seen at the concert had been the Fabricator General, but none had noticed his absence, so wrapped up in the grief the Adepts were now expressing. The third day passed as similar to nearly every other day of the Siege of Claws, biomunitions, and roars of chittering mandibles. The line in front of the Eternity Gate continued to hold not one step back. The psychic singing of the batteries continued all that time unabated until the nearing end. Near the top of the pyramid structure that was centered in the dead center of the throne room was the throne proper. On it sat the husk of the Master of Mankind, hooked up to the throne with a multitude of wires attached to the ever-decaying core, linking his neural system to the archaeotech that allowed the Emperor to project his psychic essence to the astronomic in the psychic lighthouse that projected the light that had guided the once uncounted numbers of void craft across the galaxy. That lighthouse was now vastly reduced in function. The shadow and the warp from the hive fleets had blotted out its light in the warp to only the tiniest of candlelight, only visible to the void craft that may have survived the battle that had taken place in Terra's orbit. As one would descend the pyramid, the pods that contained the power source of the throne were evenly spaced in terraces that was watched by a member of the 10,000, their watch never ceasing in their duty to their lord. Here and there a tech adept that had been specifically trained their entire elongated centuries of life for the honor of working on this last bit of archaeotechnology from the dark of technology. The Adepts had somehow over the last 4 centuries managed to somehow continue the operation of the throne, even though increasingly of its parts were finally succumbing to the rust and entropy that was the end of all things, the end that not even Master of Mankind could escape. Robout Gilliman and Lionel Johnson stood near the peak of the towering obelisk looking at their creator. Lion was the first to speak. The end and the death. A proper title, don't you think, brother? I believe that. This is our end. I am happy that these last few centuries I was able to at least be in your presence again. The knowledge that I was no longer alone, forced to pretend to the hordes of humanity that the vile religion they practiced was acceptable, and holding my tongue so much that there were times that I could feel the disgust I felt for the thing they did in their fanaticism. It was old by the end of the first week. Lion nodded. His own rewaking had also been a shock to his transhuman core countless times over, as he had seen, heard, and witnessed what humanity had become so far fallen from the tentative hope that had been the center of the crusade. Knowledge had been lost, never to be rediscovered. Reason and logic had been replaced by fear and dogmatic religious zealotry. The people of the Imperium had become nothing but lost sheep. A hand moved to the shoulder of the Lord Regent. I understand, brother. 3 simple words, but the effect it made was noticeable. The sagging of a shoulder. Both Primarchs looked at the husk of their father and were contented in the comfort of each other. 2 brothers staring at the ever-growing abyss laying before them. The clock was about to hit midnight. The end and the death was here, and it started just an hour after the last of the psychers had expired. A low rumbling groan came from the throne. It shook the room slowly but with increasing strength. The scale of the shakes kept growing and growing. Outside at the battle line of Eternity Gate, a shout rose from the throats of all the defenders of the palace. For the Master of Mankind, God Emperor beloved by all, we stand here unbeaten and unbowed. For Terra in Excelsior, the sister of the Sorite sprang forward out of their cover with her chain sword revved and roaring. The zeal clear for all to see in her tired sea-green eyes. I know no fear. Her declaration sent a shiver through those around her into action of their own. We know no fear. The cry was picked up quickly across the line as Militarum, Astartes, and even the ever-stoic warriors of the 10,000. Celestine, Valorous, the estate speaker, and the Lord Commander of the Guard, standing to their full unbowed height, a charge was initiated and followed up on by the masses of the defenders. Better to die fighting on your feet than to see what would happen soon. The charge was supported by the artillery and tanks that had continued their service, many showing their wear and tear that could not be hidden. A single night walker riddled by dents and scorch marks from the swarm from a lone house that few if any had heard the name of charged forward, its mounted chain sword ready to spill the blood of the foul Xenos that had come to the throne world in its every ravenous hunger. The swarm roared back at the defenders. Finally, the prey had made its move. The rumbling from the throne continued, increasing its powerful shock waves to where most of the palace was now trembling in the light came from first the glass eye of the Master of Mankind. The light then began appearing from every nook and crevice of the husk, building its blinding aura. The trembling increased again, now shaking another of Terra's continents, then another, until finally the whole planet, with all its destroyed hives, with their unnumbered destroyed and ruined skyscrapers, shook with the fury of the throne's end, as the defenders of Terra sacrificed their lives, as the star that had given life to the species that now neared the abyss withered and died from the psychic backlash of humanity's final moments. A single foot stepped off the dais of the throne and then stepped forward. The warp M42. The Emperor stepped forward, his presence so powerful and awe-inspiring that it would have left even his sons, both loyal, traitor, and forgotten, weeping in admiration. He looked back at the newest hole in the fabric of reality. Where once had been the core worlds of Segmentum Solar was now a warp rift that equaled the famed Eye of Terror in size and ferocity. The Emperor sighed a sigh that spoke of his failures that had led to this. He looked around where he had entered the warp. But he was not alone in this final battlefield at the end. Across the way there were the four. The disgusting tumors of unreality stood, their legions of demons and their armies of traitor estates, cultists, and others unnumbered. The first of the four was the Lord of Murder, who stood proudly with his legions of brass and skulls, eagerly ready to lay their serrated blades into the anathema. To the Lord of Skull's side was the grandfather of pestilence, the Rot Master, he who conjures the most disgusting of plagues. Their demons were prancing around many cauldrons of rot and decay. Then was the ever-shifting changer of ways, the schemer, the manipulator of hopes and unmade dreams. His hordes were chanting in unknown and known languages that had graced humanity and the many Xenos of the galaxy from the beginning. And finally, rounding out the four, was the Lord, Lady of Excess and Horrifying Pleasure. The masquerade of its never-born were dancing in unfiltered, provocative, possessed, trapped in their rapture of excess. Anathema, you have finally arrived. The four voices boomed across the barren and empty place of the warp that had been chosen in past, present, and future for exactly this moment. We were growing tired of waiting for you, betrayer. Let us finish our dance. What were your flawed, loyal lapdogs of sons' words? Oh yes, the end and the death. The Emperor looked at the four unamused. Yes, it is the end and the death, all right. The end and the death of you four, the blights of all life that would ever exist. I had long prepared for this moment, just as you have. The Master of Mankind raised a fiery sword from his side before setting it down on the ground. Just like you, I am not without my own followers. From the ground rose the spirits of the slain, the untold quadrillions that had died in his service over the 11 millennium he had sat immobile, preparing for this end of time. They were the Astartes of old and new, the 10,000 come again, the masses of the guard who had perished in known and unknown theaters of eternal war, and the following of the Sisters of Battle. The two sides glared at each other, both ready to finally settle this fight once and for all. No words of any kind were spoken or unspoken between the two camps. They remained that way. Was it for a moment or a million years? None could say on either side. The flow of time in the immaterium was not in any way comparable to the flow in the material universe. It was with nods for the five gods that the newest chapter of the great game of the gods began. They battled and battled, neither side giving ground. Back and forth, a tug of endless war that no one willing to lose or give up on. Then something happened that the Master of Mankind had planned for. The slightest of chances that had been seen by the Changer of Ways happened. The glass shattered. A thrust of power came from within the Emperor, cutting into the Changer. The unfathomable one gasped in shock, bringing the other three's attention to the Lord of Change. Tzinch fell to the ground before melting into a fine powdery dust. The effect was instantaneously significant. The forces of change slammed on the brakes, looking at where the Changer had fallen. The forces of order pounced upon the parts of the line held by the manipulator's host. How? The three bellowed in raw hate, fury, and the hint of fear. That is a secret that only I will ever know. Tumors. The next strike of energy slammed into the Lord, Lady of Excess and Pleasure. The blow leaving the pink one screaming its pain cries, distracting the masks of pleasure, allowing the forces of order to push upon them in greater strength, slaughtering more than had been usual. The grandfather moved forward to cover the Prince of Excess, attacking from the right, his diseased steps leaving stinking rotted footprints. The Lord of Murder also moved forward, engaging the anathema from the left, a smile crossing its demonic face. The mysterious energy rose again in the Emperor before it fired again, this time hitting the Lord of Murder, his anguished screams shaking the warp in his pain. The Rot Maker launched his bloated form forward, his pus-filled blade struck the flame sword of the Emperor. The stench was unbearable, and many tens of thousands of the forces of order around the Emperor fell to the ground, hurling and drowning in their bodily fluids. The Emperor returned the blow with a slight grunt, pushing the grandfather back towards where the Prince of Excess still lay kneeling in pain from the strike inflicted upon it. Its left side was burnt badly, a foul smell of burnt meat swamping the air with the smell. The Master of Mankind pushed the advantage and shot another beam of light from his body, cutting the Plague Maker in his gaseous stomach, a clean cut that leaked entrails and fluid from the disgusting manifestation. The Emperor then brought his sword down on the downed prince. Another scream erupted from the prince before silence started to induce dread in the masks of the prince as their master no longer made a sound. The roar that emerged from the Lord of Murder was harsh and bestial in its rage, his blood-crusted sword slamming into the side of the Master of Mankind's flank, instead of the expected pain sounds that should have emerged from the god of humanity. He gritted his teeth and turned his attention to the blood god. Another beam of the unknown light sliced into the goat leg on the warrior's right, bringing the being down, landing on numerous demons and forces of order, crushing them into oblivion. The Emperor spat blood onto the fallen god before bringing his blade across the throat of the Master of Skulls, decapitating the fiend. Again, the forces of order took advantage of a god's death to move forward and push chaos back. The Emperor, seeing that his followers had the minor details covered, grimaced, and turned to the last of the 4 godly blood flowing out of the wound that the blood god had inflicted. The Plague Maker looked more afraid now that he was the last one standing. It let out a slow pain chuckle. Impressive anathema. You are still undeserving of your ascension. But this scenario was projected by Tzinch in no more than 45 of the possible paths that they saw. The Emperor merely looked at his final opponent with a critical eye, not responding to the backhanded compliment. His secret weapon that had contributed to his success took a lot of energy from him each time he used it. He had 1 or 2 of the attacks left, and while the rotting king was injured, it was not as much as he had hoped. The two circled each other, each step crushing their warriors underfoot. The minor pieces did not matter in this fight. The kings did. Regret flared up in the Emperor. That emotion had been growing stronger and stronger, overcoming the callous walls he had built for himself over the millennium. The circling continued unabated, both combatants looking at the others, searching for the hint of a weakness that would be the opener for the next phase of this duel of fates. After what seemed like an eternity, the weakness was found. The Plague Father moved faster than what a bloated, decaying part corpse should have and slammed into the Emperor, pushing him backwards, crushing many millions of the forces of order with the force of the push as the Emperor tried to regain his balance. The next blow was as from a rot-infested morning star, the spike piercing into the Emperor's breastplate, crushing one of the heads of the Imperial Aquila underneath with its force. A third blow wrapped the pus chain around the left arm of the Emperor and then pulled with godly strength that snapped the arm, making bone jut out of the gauntlets and skin. The Emperor suppressed a scream with the might of his willpower that was ready to come forth from his lips. He swung his sword, bringing its fire down on the right arm of Nurgle, slicing through the diseased flesh, sinew, and bone, making rotted ichor spill forth in a flood from the wound. The first wound also sprang back, joining the flood of fluid that made the ground beneath both into a wretched swamp of ungans, drowning demon, human, and transhumans in the filth. The Morning Star joined the fray, coming down again on the chest plate, destroying the other Aquila and making it more difficult to breathe in oxygen in an already hazardous atmosphere from being in close contact with Nurgle. The Emperor made the next strike, launching his energy into the Master of Plagues. The beam of holy light cut into the body of his enemy, blowing a massive hole that could fit several galaxies in the wound. Nurgle groaned and fell backwards a few steps, crushing more pawns underneath the unimaginable weight. Again, the Emperor pushed onwards, throwing his body into motion. Multiple swings of his blade raked into his opponent's body, cutting through its flesh with the flames setting alight much of the legs of the opposing god. A flurry of blows continued the assault, slicing the horn and face muscles on the right side of the rotten god's head off to the base of its skull. The roar from the Plague Father deafened everyone in the area. However, it was time to end the fight. The Emperor could taste victory. He was so close to his long-held goal that he had sacrificed everything he had ever known and cared for to this dream. Regret flared again, taking the air from the Emperor's lungs before more rancid air filled them again. Using the last of his reserves that had been saved for his secret weapon, launched one final beam at his foe, cutting another hole through the plague spawner's body. The damage was horrific. More of the skeleton hidden beneath the atrophied flesh was now exposed in all its disgusting glory to the open air, tainting it further. Charging forward, the Emperor poured his righteous fury into his still good sword arm and many arcs upon his down foe, smashing him into the ground with the ferocity of assault. Nurgle crumbled into the ground, sending more of the pawns into oblivion. Another blow popped the remaining eye, a second took the other horn. The third to where a human's heart would be. Fourth stab was into the lungs, with the organ catching alight, the abomination made in the mockery of the human form. The fifth and final sweep of the blade downwards, the move that would end this struggle. However, that move never came. A sharp and sudden pain gripped the Master of Mankind's pain receptors. He looked down. There was the arm of Nurgle protruding into his stomach, through his damaged breastplate. The rot, disease, and entropy filled his body, immediately starting to break down his organs, skin, and bones. A choked gasp escaped past the Emperor's decaying lips. A wet chuckle emerged from his foe, who was no longer able to move. I have surprises to betrayer. I made this poison especially for you. Hope it is to your tastes. If we cannot enjoy our victory, neither shall you. Those were the last words uttered by the fiend. The injuries it had sustained finally pushed it into expiration. The armies of chaos were now completely gone, the wills that sustained them passing from unreality, allowing the remaining forces of order to finish them off in their entirety. However, they too were nearing their own end. They were disappearing as the remaining vitality of their liege lord, God, faded. Spots of darkness began growing in the now milky white eyes of the Emperor, the golden irises never to return. The end and the death. It had finally come. Regret was now the only emotion that filled the mind of the Master of Mankind. And as he slipped into the blackness fully, reality and unreality broke apart, leaving nothing in what had been the Milky Way. There was nothing but the cold, harsh black of nothingness. This was the true end, the true death, or it would have been had a small light no bigger than a match had not left the shell of being, slipping through the exposed cracks that appeared for but a singular moment. This tiny light would lead to something no one could have considered, a new and untainted dream. Terra approximate circa unknown, guessed to be 785 m-1 by later scholars. Malta, the ritual circle was finally complete. It had been painstaking work for the shamans and their apprentices. 15 cycles of the sun and moon over the heads of the humans who had drawn it. The circles gleamed with symbols in many languages, each written with one singular purpose for the ceremony that was to come. It had been a struggle for the head shaman, a struggle that had caused much grief for those that would participate in its conclusion on this day. They were waiting for the final few members of the coven to arrive from far distant lands to the east of the landmass that was to be the site of this undertaking. They had nodded to several other shamans who were sitting outside their great work. They could see the fear on their faces of what was to come if they did not carry out this ritual. The visions of that dark future that had shown itself to all the shamans had caused many of the weaker-willed members of the coven to end their own lives, even though it was clear what would be their fate should they do such an act. The stronger ones had met psychically many times and discussed the options available to them when a course of action had been finally agreed upon. It had been to meet in person and perform this ritual. They were going to prevent that lingering nightmare from ever forming, even if it would be their own indubial ends. They had been the silent watchmen of their species, attending to the ills inflicted upon them physically and spiritually. It was still early in the day, the sun rising in the west showering the land around the hill they stood on in beautiful golden light. Just like the one they had foreseen, the last straggling members of the coven made their way up the hill. They brought the needed last numbers for the great work. As the sun continued to rise, lighting up the hill, the project began. Words chanted in many tongues were sung, pouring the collective psychic essences into the ground, powering up the written words drawn upon it. When the sun reached midday, the grim task began. The head shaman moved from their position at the center of the circle and reached the first of its comrades at what would be the 12 on a clock, and drawing a wicked, jagged-looking bone knife, they brought the blade up to the throat of the first sacrifice. With only a single cut straight and clean across, the head shaman started their bloody work. The body of the first dropped to the ground inside the circle. A look of extreme sadness crossed the face of the leader before moving to the next one. And so, it continued, each shaman falling to the ground unceremoniously as their throat was cut, no one to remember their names, faces, or legacies and deeds that had been given to the communities of humanity from which they had come. They had all agreed that this was preferable to what was to come. That future had to never occur. The bodies continued dropping, however the ceremony did not falter in its purpose. As the last shaman fell to the ground, the head stepped into the middle of the circle again. She raised the blood-stained knife to her own throat, and just before the cut was made, shouted out a sentence that was their collective plea to the one who would save them all. The knife made the cut straight and clean, just like all the others. Her body fell and joined the 999 others in death's embrace, and thus passed the shaman coven of ancient Terra, disappearing into the abyss, never to re-emerge again, spiritually or physically again, as the ritual had also been designed to forcefully suppress the psychic potential of the species for a time, until it was ready to join the Golden One in protecting their species from a harsh and uncaring galaxy. The shamans, however, had not considered one important thing. What if the vision they had seen of that dark and depressing future was not of their own reality? What if it was the ghost of another whose future was already determined, brought to them on the skeins of fate through a broken hole in the fabric of reality by the fickle and unpredictable nature of the Immaterium's branching influences through this cluster of the multiverse? That thought had never crossed their minds, and probably would have never crossed the participants' thoughts, for they were a young species not yet knowledgeable in the understanding of the warp. This ritual and its consequences would lead to something that no one could have predicted. Not the other side that would remain in the dark, not the strange and unusual beings that would begin to populate the world in later millennium alongside humanity. Not even the gods themselves could have seen or even have stopped the outcome. For they were not even yet conceived in the minds of the human cultures who would later worship them with blind devotion at the beginning, and then with fewer and fewer followers. No one could see what would be the results that were to come. City of Kyoto, Japan, M2 1995. General Hospital, Room 195. 7 a.m. The sun was slowly rising over the city of Kyoto. Its gold and red beams of solar light was truly a sight to behold by anyone who was awake and moving. The first beams of that life were hitting a large, somewhat dated white building that had a sign reading Kyoto General Hospital in kanji. On the second floor of the 5-floor building was a room, and in said room were a small group of people who were not able to enjoy the start of this new day. In fact, for two of the room's users it was a precious that would either lead to great joy or to more heartbreak. The first of the duo was holding his wife's hand, showering her with love and support as she was laying on a maternity hospital bed, screaming her lungs out as the contractions continued. The man's name is Goro Hayato, and today he was to become a father again. Goro was a man making the transition from being a young man to that of a man beginning to reach middle age. He had short brown hair that was cut close to his head, the only strange or unusual thing about his hair being two small strands that were downwards in an almost V-like shape. He wore glasses that covered his warm brown eyes that gazed at his wife with distinct worry. He winced slightly as his hand was being crushed by his wife as another round of pain hit. His eyes met hers, an unspoken word of "I love you, I'm here" passed between them, before wincing more openly as his hand was again crushed by the strength of his wife as another contraction came. Laying on the bed was one Miki Hayato, the also brown-haired and brown-eyes happily married wife of Goro. She was like her husband, beginning the move from young adult to middle age. That move, however, had not diminished her beauty and kindness. No, it had started to refine both into showing to the world that here was a person that was a shining example of a good person. The couple were just that good people. Their neighbors never had a single dreadful thing to say about them. They were pillars of the community that they both lived in. But they had long carried in their hearts a silent pain. Mickey had been pregnant before, twice in fact, but both times the child that was to be had not come into the world breathing. Miscarriages that had made this couple's otherwise amazing lives feel hollow and empty. The reason for the tragedies was that Mickey had a medical condition that made it harder for her to have children. It was something that had led to countless nights of her weeping into the early hours of the morning while being held by her husband, who never blamed her for anything that had happened. When she had discovered 9 months ago that she was pregnant again, the overwhelming joy of the news had been tempered with the harsh remembrance of the past. However, they were certain that this time, instead of tragedy, this time it would be the start of something new and beautiful. They had read up on ways to help ensure that this time would be different, done step-by-step exercises, eaten healthier than ever before, and had in a rare moment of their mostly secular lives prayed to the Shinto for a safe delivery. The moment of truth was about to be foretold. The screaming increased in intensity. Mickey's voice was beginning to crack, and with the doctor's calm and collect urging, a little body came into the world. For a moment, the tiny baby did not cry. The couple saw this and their hearts fell close to the abyss of despair. However, that moment of silence had ended as quickly as it began, as the little baby took its first breath and let out a cry that was for the parents wondrous to behold. "It's a handsome boy, Mr. and Mrs. Hayaudu," the doctor said, an extremely happy smile crossing his face, one that was shared by the newly minted parents. A choked, wet, greatly reduced voice came from Mickey. "May I please hold him?" "Of course, Mrs. Hayaudu, I was just about to bring him to you." The still wailing baby was passed to his mother's arms, her face tired and tear-stained. Her hazel eyes looked at her son, the one who had now completed her world. "He's so handsome, Goru. Just like you." The words made the new father start weeping in pure joy along with his wife. This was the single happiest moment in his entire life. They had triumphed against the odds, and it would only get better from here on out. The man gazed upon his son and noticed the little tufts of hair, brown as freshly tilled soil, were on the boy's head. "He is your hair, Mickey." The baby had continued his wailing, though its intensity, and when he opened his eyes staring into that of his parents, they noticed with surprise that instead of their eye color of a brown similar to their hair, it was instead a brown that was in truth closer to golden in its hue. The crying stopped as the baby continued to glance at his parents. For a moment, the two new parents could have sworn that his eye color turned completely golden before it returned to its original color. It was just a trick of the eye, both parents decided almost instantaneously, a result of their exhaustion that had come from the delivery and relief of their child's entrance to the world. Mickey began rocking the baby, and within a few moments their son fell asleep. "What should we name him, Goru?" "We could never agree on a name, and we did want it to be a surprise on what gender they would be." The parents sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, deep in contemplation. "How about Issei?" Mickey shook her head at the name. "It's a good name, but I don't think it feels right. Maybe Juzo, after your father." This time it was Goru's turn to shake his head. "As much as my father would like that, I'm not sure that it would fit him. Maybe Issei." Something seemed to sing in the new parents' souls with the name. "Issei, Issei, that's his name, I love it, dear. Hello Issei, I am your mommy. And I'm your father's son." Both parents gazed on the sleeping baby boy as he snoozed, afraid that if they looked away this tiny miracle would disappear, and they would wake up from this and see that it was nothing but a dream. This was no dream, and reality would show itself soon enough. City of Kuom-2, 1996. The first year of Issei Hayaudu's life on Earth was turbulent journey of highs and lows of a typical baby. He wet his dipper often, giggled frequently at the antics that occurred inside the Hayaudu residence, and was a happy baby who made his folks treasure every moment with their miracle child. He had surprised his parents with how quiet he was, rarely crying or making a fuss. It had made the lives of his parents calmer than what the parenting books had said was normal for a baby. They had been worried, wondering if there was something wrong with him, but that fear had never materialized. Issei did fulfill the part of curiosity and then blasted past it. He was always watching the adults, never taking his eyes off of them. Sometimes Mickey and Goru almost felt like their child would watch them with a hyper-intense focus that they could have sworn was like that of a full-grown adult. There were a few other strange things about their child that they began noticing. Mickey had been in the kitchen preparing food for Issei when the sound of a plate smashing on the kitchen floor. Mickey turned around quickly and saw that the plate that she had bought out of the cupboard and placed on the table had fallen to the floor. She didn't know how that happened and just assumed that she had placed the plate too close to the edge. She would have considered that a one-time incident had it not happened several more times. Issei had also shown that he was a very quick learner, saying his first word at 7 months. It had warmed his parents' hearts, that word, Mama. He would use that word many times, and it had been a great day for Mickey and Goru. It had seemed to do unlock something in their son, and he was soon learning other words at an increasingly fast rate. He learned potty training quickly too, along with many other things that the books had stated would take time, such as crawling and then walking, which Issei managed at 8 months and 9 months, respectively. It wasn't long before Issei became a little always curious terror, asking a million questions per minute, determined to learn everything and anything he could. It was an exhausting experience, but his parents wouldn't change it for anything. City of Kyoto 1997 to 2001 M2 to M3. The Hayato family's lives had continued without pause. In the years following 1996, Issei continued to surprise his parents at every turn. His inclination to ask questions constantly had transformed him into a mini-scholar and had become a studious boy never not found without a book in his hand after learning how to read at an incredibly early age. This had finally made his folks coin him as a genius, and soon Issei's room was filled with bookshelves upon bookshelves of books that ranged from the first books for young children to later books on fantasy and science fiction. Issei had really enjoyed science fiction. Fantasy was alright but didn't seem to hold or completely capture his attention. He would often talk his parents' ears off about space and its many wonders. How he would describe some of the places that his mind had cooked up were incredibly strange, however, such as worlds that were covered in megacities or worlds that were filled with primal tribes of disparate humans to worlds that were still in the medieval age. Issei insisted that they were real places filled with real people, and Issei's parents indulged him with his tales. When Issei had started school, in 1999, it was quickly very apparent that he was far ahead of his peers. However, Issei never spoke down to them and was one of the most sociable kids that many of the school's minders and teachers had seen. However, Issei had few real friends. Two, in fact. The first was a young boy that had been incredibly shy and had been withdrawn from his peers. Issei had marched over to him and, grabbing some building blocks, had set to work making a tower that had finally brought interest to the shy boy. The two of them had played with those blocks for half an hour before the boy's parents had picked him up from school. The once shy boy had been babbling eagerly to Issei, and when he had finally left with his parents, Issei had asked, "What's your name?" The other boy had quickly turned and said, "I'm Akio Watanabe, let's be friends forever." Akio had become a fast staple of Issei's life and become the friend that he would trust with everything. Akio had also been the one who had instigated an event that brought Issei and Akio's other friend into their lives. One day at school, Issei and Akio had been playing with a bouncy ball, passing it back and forth to each other when Akio had noticed that a small group of the boys that were in the year ahead of them were gathering around another child that looked like they were in the two boys' year. It was hard to tell if the kid was a boy or a girl, and when they began shaking from whatever the group of boys was saying, Akio had poked Issei, and with one look the two of them made their way over to the bullies before shouting, "Hey, leave that kid alone." The bullies had been surprised with the words before their leader looking at the two boys who had come over. "Get lost, pipsqueaks. This doesn't concern you." It had not deterred the two younger boys, and when they didn't leave, one of the bullies suddenly charged them and punched Akio in the stomach. Akio groaned and fell to his knees. Something clicked within Issei, and seeing his friend hurt pushed the brown-haired boy into action. In less than a few seconds, Issei had attacked the instigators with a quick punch that sent one of the bullies flying backwards. A second and then third punches hit two of the other bullies, throwing them away, making the other two aggressors look at Issei with wide eyes. One broke and ran from the group while the leader had looked unimpressed before he went on the attack. Issei took multiple hits from the leader, and those hits that should have put down a boy Issei's age didn't seem to faze him with. But a single powerful punch Issei decked the leader, breaking his nose and knocking one of his teeth out. The older boy fell to the floor and didn't get up. "What is going on here?" That was the voice of the minder that was assigned to the schoolyard that day, her eyes looking at the violence that had occurred on their watch. She turned to Issei and Akio, who had by now gotten back on his feet, and the minder narrowed her eyes at the scene before her. 5 older children on the ground around a child who looked to have been crying, and what looked to be 2 boys from the crying child's ear. It wasn't hard to piece together what had happened. "You 3 are coming with me." The minder gathered the children up, and with the blow of a whistle another of the minders had come over, this time a young man, and seeing the situation at hand began gathering up the 5 bullies who were moaning in pain. The first minder has marched the children inside the school building before having them sit in chairs in front of the office of the principal. "Stay here and don't move a muscle," had been what the minder had said before entering the office. And so, the 3 had sat and waited until after what seemed to be an eternity later for the kids. 3 groups of adults were hurrying their way down the hall over to their children. Issei knew who 4 of them were and had correctly guessed that the last pair of adults were the crying kids' parents. 5 minutes later, the door to the office opened and the minder appeared and gestured for the 9 to come in. Chairs had been placed before an oaken desk, and behind the desk was a stern-faced woman with dark black hair that was beginning to show the tiniest hints of sliver. Her eyes were looking at the assembly of children and adults with a grimace that told everyone that there would be serious consequences from this meeting. The principal looked to the minder and gave the slightest nod of her head when the cacophony of voices from the 6 parents had ceased after demanding to know what had happened. The minder went on to describe the events in the courtyard, and Issei and Akio's parents were both amazed and dismayed by what was told to them. The 2 unknown parents had been angry and had demanded to know what would be done to the bullies who had started this. The principal has assured them that the 5 older boys would receive harsh punishments. The older woman's gaze had then fallen on Issei and Akio. For a moment, Issei could have sworn that he heard a whisper of a voice that sounded like the principal that was saying that the 2 younger boys in front of her were giant idiots. Brave idiots who were doing the right thing, but idiots nevertheless. The punishment had been harsh. Akio and Issei would be forced to stay inside the school during outdoor breaks for 2 weeks, helping the janitors clean up the school. The boys held their heads in shame and took the walk with their parents after the meeting ended. The car ride home had been cold and silent for Issei. His parents did not say a single word to him for the rest of the day. It was when Issei had been about to head to sleep that his father and mother had finally said something. "We are disappointed in you, Eyes. Violence is not always the answer." A moment passed before a small smile passed onto their faces. "However, you did do a good thing today, standing up for someone even though you didn't know their name. For that we are proud of you." When Issei had showed up to the point where he and Akio had been told to come to for the start of the two's punishment, he was very surprised to see the kid that they had stood up for there and waiting for them, a small broom in their hands. Now that Issei could get a proper look at them, he noticed now that it was a girl with such short brown hair that she could have passed for a boy done up in the beginnings of Twin Tales. She looked at Akio and then Issei before saying, "Thank you for what you both did yesterday." She glanced nervously to the ground before looking back at the two boys and seemingly finding her steel. She said, "I'm Irina Shido. Please take care of me." She then bowed lowly to them. Issei shook his head at the display before he gently took Irina's hand. Friends don't have to bow so low to each other. Irina's face now level with Issei and Akko's again lit up with a smile that could blind a lesser person. "You really consider me a friend?" Akio spoke this time. "Yeah, friends look out for each other no matter what." Thus, the dyad became a triad of brother, sisterhood of the closest of friends. Issei was the bedrock and glue of the three, the unofficial leader, even though they were all equal in each other's eyes. However, Irina's addition to Issei's life brought with it several strange encounters and feelings. The first was a strong feeling of disgust whenever the girl or her parents brought up the topic of religion. Irina's family were very devout Protestants. They did amazingly good things brought forth by their faith, such as when the family would volunteer at the local shelters and soup kitchens in Kyo, or when they gave their money to charities in good faith that it would be used to better the world. Issei, however, could see the sometimes extremely judgmental attitude that would overcome his friend's parents over things that his parents and Akio's would let slide. The feelings of disgust were muted but always there in a small piece of his mind that was never not present. Issei had followed in his parents' footsteps and believed in the Shinto. He wasn't super devout just like them, but every so often he would see the hint of a sneer cross the faces of Irina's parents' faces when his or Akio's would talk with them. The second incident that happened was when he was with his friend and her folks walking down a street when a feeling of unease swept through Issei, a color of black so deep and dark was caught out of the corner of his eye on what had appeared to be wings on the back of a man that had not there a moment ago. The whisper of a voice caught his ear. "Found him," before the voice disappeared as fast as it had come. Another interesting encounter had been when the trio were at a local park playing in the playground when Issei felt a slightly uncomfortable presence looking at him. He turned and there sitting on a bench near the playground was a man. His hair was a windswept silver, his one eye a gold, the other hidden behind an eye patch that looked rough and leathery. He met the eye of the man and he had smiled good-naturedly at him before the eye swept itself over to where several moms and younger women who were talking together adamant about something. Issei, when it looked into the man's eye, had felt like he was being chased by an apex predator like the ones that he had read of in humanity's ancient past. They had been leaving the park when Issei had seen the old man explaining something excitedly to two boys that looked his age, one with glasses and black hair, and the other with a buzz-cut head. The only word from the loud exchanges he could catch was something called oppai, and when he had gotten home, he had looked up the term on his computer that his parents had gotten for him last year. The term's search results made him confused, deeply intrigued, and somewhat disgusted, as it seemed to be viewed solely through a singular lens. That had been reinforced when he asked his parents about the term and if people really found it to be that interesting. His mother had gaped at what had been asked, and in the incredibly rare case of physical punishment he had ever received, been slapped across the face by her, demanding to know where he had learned that term. Issei had replied that he had heard it at the park from a strange old man with an eye patch. His mom had then said, angered beyond belief, to never say that term again until he was much older. He had nodded furiously and then ran back up the stairs to his room. He deleted his search history from his computer and made a vow to not ask about this oppai ever again. He could have sworn that some part of him was deeply fascinated with the term, but a bigger part was not. A faint ghost of a sound had reached his ears, just like when he had been with Irina's parents and again with the principal at school. Good job. The final incident of note was when he had been at Irina's home playing a game of Make the Weirdest Animal, which he would usually win because of the description of the animals that came from his imagination were so fantastical that Irina could not outplay him in his creativity. Irina's mom had called them down for lunch, and when the two had arrived in the family room that was in front of the kitchen, Issei felt something giving off an aura that many would call holy, but Issei would have called it something completely different. He turned his head to the fireplace, and on the mantel was what looked like a sword. It was masterfully made, though Issei didn't know how he knew that, and when he really looked at it, the sword was not a Japanese type of sword, but rather a Western-style long sword. So focused on the weapon was Issei that he didn't notice or hear Irina's father come up right next to him. Instead of saying anything, Irina's father merely watched his daughter's friend. "It's a beautiful weapon, isn't it, lad?" The word made Issei jump. The man noted that while he had jumped, it had not been as high as one would expect from a 6-year-old. "Sorry, sir. I didn't hear you, and yeah, it's a pretty nice sword." The two stood in silence before the man spoke softly. "Would you like to hold it? It's a replica weapon, something I picked up in trashy tourist spot when we went to Italy last year." Issei didn't answer for a moment before he nodded. Irina's father went up to the sword and gently removed it from the rack holding it and drew the blade from its scabbard. It was a truly beautiful weapon, and Issei could now tell that it was truly a masterly crafted weapon. Be careful, Issei, it's sharp. Issei gently took the sword and without noticing settled into a stance that only someone who had wielded a blade like a long sword would know of. Irina's father watched with interest at the stance. Issei could feel the weight of the blade. It was only a little bit too heavy for him. His dedication to leading a healthy lifestyle, a result of his parents, made the boy somewhat of a bigger anomaly at the school. Most of the children didn't exercise outside of the breaks the school allocated them. Issei was so in tune with moving the blade that he was shocked out of the trance-like state by a shout that came from the kitchen. Issei dropped the blade and accidentally cut himself. The pain was sharp, and Issei yelped, a cut clearly being seen on his right arm. Irina's father jumped straight into action and began to put pressure on the wound. What he saw next amazed him. The cut quickly began closing at an incredibly fast rate. Before less than a minute later, the injury was gone as it had never been there at all. Irina's father looked at it in amazement before asking Issei, "You healed fast." "Why?" Issei simply, his eyes closed and his breathing a little heavy. "I don't know. I have always been like that. My parents and I don't understand it." The man looked up and down the boy's face, searching for the hint of a lie. When he could find none, he nodded. "I see." There was a pause before Issei's friend's father gently took the sword back from him, placing it back on its rack. He gently guided the boy to the kitchen to clean up the blood. Issei left about 2 hours later, and when night fell on the Shido house, Irina's father made a call to his work. "I found something amazing today, your worship." The voice on the other end of the telephone was very intrigued by the sheer excitement that she could hear in the agent's voice. "What did you find?" The man pushed on. "I think I have found an excellent recruit for the cause." That surprised the woman. Recruits from where her agent was stationed were incredibly rare, what with most of the population of Japan believing not in the one true God but rather their backwards simulacrum that they took for gods. Her agent continued, "Yes, a recruit. There is a young boy who is friends with my daughter. He caught my attention when earlier this year he single-handedly stopped 5 boys in the year above him from bullying her at the school they attend. He injured all of them with but a single punch. I thought that maybe he had one of the gears that increases a person's strength. But now I'm convinced that his gear is something else entirely. He was here today and noticed my sword. He was gazing at it so intently that he didn't hear when I approached him. On a whim I offered to let him hold the blade, and when he held the blade something within him jump-started, and he held that blade in a way that spoke of experience. That was definitely something that the woman would have never believed if it had been from any other but Taoji." Her agent continued on, "However, the boy was so invested in the sword, moving it so well, that I was about to ask him if he had had lessons before, but a shout broke his concentration, and the blade nicked his right arm." The woman winced at that confession, but before she could ask if the boy was okay, Taoji continued to talk. "I was moving forward with some cloth ready to put pressure on the wound when I watched as a miracle from the Lord took place. The wound closed completely in less than a minute. The bleeding after 25 seconds. I think that this boy might have 2 of the gears, perhaps sword birth, and maybe one of the regeneration ones that must be powerful enough to do that." The woman's mouth had now completely dropped to the floor. A human with 2 of the Lord gears was so incredibly rare that the number of recorded instances of that happening was less than 50 in all of history. "How old is the child, Taoji?" The eagerness in her own voice tempered with that of the philosophy of the 10-winged one she served. 5 going on 6. "Madam, do I have permission to approach the parents and inquire if he and they would like to convert and begin serving the Lord?" The woman could hear how eager and ready her agent was, waiting on the answer with bated breath. She hesitated and considered her options. This child could be the next advantage that the church and heaven had been looking for. The Cold War between the big three had continued to drag onward with no hint of cooling down. It was why things such as the creation of the Siegfried Institute and the new Holy Sword Project had been approved on by the leaders of the Christian faiths. The other 2 factions had also been stepping up their own efforts to match and then outpace the church and heaven. This would be a decision that she alone could not make. Angelia, a 4-winged angel of heaven, finally answering her subordinate. "I can't give you a go-ahead, Taoji. I'll have a full discussion with my superiors and will call back in an hour." The silence that followed was tangible, but Taoji finally spoke, his disappointment the answer he wanted right away notable in his response. "Of course, madam, I eagerly await the response." With those words the call ended. Angelia sighed. Her agent was sometimes too zealous for his own good. Seeing only the short-term gains, which was good for an exorcist, was not conducive for more serious work higher up the chain. Setting the phone down, the 4-winged angel opened a magical communication to her superior up in heaven. The call rang for but a moment before it was answered. "Hello, Congelia. What can I help you with?" The 4-winger swallowed and then began her report. When she finished, the stillness of the other end was telling of the shock they probably felt, and after what seems to be an hour, her boss spoke. "This child sounds as if he truly is blessed by Father. His recruiting would be absolutely fortuitous and very well could be the thing that could help in our struggle. I, however, do not think we should move forward with this plan. Not yet anyway." The order was as Angelia expected. Her mistress was the head of a small but growing peace faction that was getting tired of the fighting that had continued on after the end of the Great War. Kagelia was also a member of the faction, however she was mostly on the fence about peace. She was tired of losing field agents to the other two and even more tired of all the pointless back and forth fighting and small skirmishes in the field and behind closed doors. The wounds of the war, the physical, mental, and ever-present spiritual, has not yet left her. What should we do, my lady? Gabriel, one of the 4 great seraphs of heaven, replied with a sadness in her voice that all that heard it would have joined in with its grief. The child is too young. We will recruit him when he reaches the age of 7. Let him enjoy a little bit of peace and quiet before we drag him into the mud and grime of our problems. I also want you to assign one of our brothers or sisters to watch him at this time so that no one should threaten that peace. Can you do that for me, Congelia? Of course, my lady. I am as loyal to you as I am to Michael and father. I obey. The voice of Gabriel took a happier tone. Thank you, sister. I'll let you go for the night. May Father bless you in all that you do. May Father bless you too, my lady. The line was cut and Congelia made another call before reaching to the phone to her agent about his next orders. The future that seemed clear for young Issei was laid out now, certain as stone. However, the skeins of fate were always in motion, never stopping, never ceasing. A single crack would break that future. City of Kyoto, Japan, 2003 M2. Hayato Residence, 9 p.m. The Kinya, 2-winged angel of heaven, was quietly relaxing at her watch point that was in view of the front part of the home of a human that had somehow caught the attention of the church in heaven. The assignment had been boring to the extreme. Malkinia understood why it had been given. The target was supposed to be someone who was incredibly special, and with the Cold War between the big 3 still ongoing, it was necessary for them to watch and protect potential assets. Thankfully, this Snorefest was almost over. The asset's birthday was in a day, and then an exorcist agent that was in the area would make the offer, and the asset would finally join the forces of light. Malkinia was the best watcher from the angels of heaven that was deployed to the east, where the Abrahamic faiths were the minority instead of a majority like in most of the rest of the world. However, Malkinia had made a mistake today that would be a breaker of the branch. She had gone to a restaurant in the nearby district that she had come to enjoy greatly, and there had been served a delicious meal of pocky and rice, not noticing that the food had contained an ingredient that was making her extra sleepy and sluggish tonight. It had been at around 10:15 that Malkinia finally passed from reality to the world of dreams. She would never wake up again. The ingredient ingested by the angel was not just making her sleepy, it had actually been killing her slowly but steadily. In the forest that was behind the residential district that contained the Hayato home, a magic circle opened, and out from it came 3 individuals. The first was a tall woman with pale skin, green eyes, and snow-white hair that was cut short. She was the leader of this operation and quickly took to the skies on with jet black wings. She did a thorough search in the air around their quarry. The woman easily spotted the at the moment still living counterpart to her and one of the others. The fallen one threw a fireball at the helpless woman. The flames ate at the body, cooking it quickly down to its bones before all that was left of the pure angel had been a single feather blow away from the pile of ash. Satisfying, thought the fallen angel, and with that done she descended to the ground to where her 2 comrades had been busy putting up wards that would keep the normals away long enough for their mission's completion. Landing at the entry point, the fallen looked to the main builder of the wards, a magician that went by the code name Argus. The man was a short and slightly fat figure that would lead you to believe he was out of shape and overweight. That was the key to his many victories. The form he wore for the world to see was a lie, a well-crafted lie that made Argus a really dangerous opponent to fight. He was a master warder, and few people could crack the products he made, making him an incredible asset for the Grigori. Next to him was the last member of the team, a grim-faced satyr that was the melee specialist of the team. His name was Pantier, and he was one of only 100 satyrs left in the world outside Mount Olympus's protective reach. The satyr carried a massive bronze war scythe enchanted with long-forgotten Greek runes that made the weapon a bane for any who challenged him. He had joined Grigori because it was the faction most open to recruitment of those not of the Abrahamic faiths. The Governor-General had long made use of those from other mythologies to help compensate for the core fallen angels' few numbers. Pantier had been with Grigori since the second half of the Great War, and its end had brought up disgust within the satyr, which was how he had joined the faction that was waiting within Grigori, the one that they were a part of, and all waiting for the day that was to come, very eager to follow through with his vision. Anevi looked at the magician. "It's done, Argus." The human let his hands drop. "The ward's finally done." "Of course, Vaya. Have I ever given reason for doubt?" The human's voice was full of giddy anticipation. He was a high-functioning psychopath, and had always made his illusion fade on his face for but a moment, reveling skin that was sandpaper like before the lie returned, and the overweight short man returned. A tick in the magic he used that had never been fixed. "You have not," she replied before looking at Pantier. The unasked question was immediately answered. "The gas main is damaged and will explode with the right amount of fire." The satyr's own smile was made worse by the shark-like teeth in his mouth that he had serrated to fine points. "Want to watch, Vi? I bet we will take out a good number of the homes in the neighborhood." Anevi was not shockingly the most stable member of the team, not because of being normal, no. It was because she was a sociopath that could not feel a hint of emotion and had never felt empathy for anyone or anything. She was the leader because of her uncaring analytical mind, not beset with the weakness that was empathy. This team was a match made in hell, each feeding the others with their cruelty and their own evil thoughts springboarded off each other. I'll pass Pantier. We have 9 more kill missions tonight and I don't want to waste time on this one. Pantier and Argus sighed. They had been hoping for a show that would make their evil hearts jump up and down in glee. The boss was indeed heartless, but that is what both loved about her. She fed their desires for death, destruction, and chaos. The fallen angel lit a small flame and placed it on a strange contraption that was almost like a regular grenade. Once it was ready, she hurled the object into one of the windows of the house. A loud crack of the glass breaking, and the very faint sound of the device landing was enough for the fallen one. "We are done," she said, and with a small gesture from her hand a magic circle appeared beneath them and the 3 vanished from view. An easy job. They would continue with their lives of evil. But the 3 had just made the greatest mistake of their long lives, for they had awakened the sleeping dragon and the 2-headed eagle that would be a tidal wave that would sweep Terra and its old, rotted foundations apart, changing many and leavening the destroyed smoldering ruins of others. They should have stopped. City of Kyoto, Japan, 2003 M3. Hayatu residence, time unknown. Issei was drifting peacefully in the space that was entirely his own, a place to contemplate and debate, a place that was the breeding ground of, as his parents called his overactive imagination, the place that was his mind. He was going to be 7 in a few days, and he was excited for the party he anticipated that his parents would plan on throwing for him. He was happy to see Akio and Arena along with the many other acquaintances that he had made in the years he had been in school. He hoped that he would get plenty of new books for his library, and he really wanted the new book that had just been released from his favorite sci-fiction author. He had been an abnormal child from his apparent genius status and from the many other strange things that occurred in his life, such as his dream. His parents never genuinely believed him when talked about the worlds and things he saw there. The massive cities that resembled mountains, the warriors clad in gold or the many colors of the rainbow, the giant men whose size was bigger than any Issei had ever seen. 21 faces stared back at him. 2 were so foggy and obscured that Issei had long ago stopped trying to see their faces. He had gotten many feelings from them: pride for what they had done, happinesses for finding them again in the cold dark void, contentment from the knowledge that they were accomplishing the task set before them, and then shame, hate, and disgust for how their fates turned, leading them to paths unspoken. The other 19 were separated into 2 groups, with the ones who looked identical in every viable way split between the 2 standings. The twins would move back and forth between the teams at random, and that had confused Issei. The group to the left was led by a massive man clad in armor that made the armor of the past look vile and pathetic. All of these men had that armor, but it varied heavily from each. The man that led the pack on the left had a bald head and what looked like some kind of wolf pelt on his shoulder. The feelings Issei had for this man were a mixture of the good and bad. A whisper came from the man. "We are so close to the fulfillment of our dream of unification. Do not abandon us. We need you in your leadership. I cannot be the one. I am unworthy of the honor of being War Master." The whisper faded and Issei looked at the man with pity and understanding. He had felt abandoned by the one he had looked up to, the one who had never been far from his side, the one he trusted with everything he had. "Father," the whisper rasped. Issei looked again at the rest of the giants on the left. When he looked at each, it was as if he had known each of them by heart. Their stories, their struggles, the ills and highs that had beset them. The feeling that Issei felt most, though, was remorse and regret. He had wronged them in many ways, often minor, but for some the wrongs had been on a level that was beyond the scope of morality. The red Cyclops looked onwards. The man with what appeared to be nails in his skull joined him as head, the man whom Issei would have made the comparison to an unhinged Batman. The giant who had had his head bowed in prayer looked up, and Issei saw the fanaticism in his eyes. The look that disgusted him, it was the same look his friend Arena's family had. But there also extreme pity. The man before him had been tortured by the one who had found him and had claimed the position of his adopted father. He had been broken and then made to follow his first family into the monster he had become. The rest of the 7 stories were told to him by the whispers, who were growing in intensity. Issei had noticed that with each face he had gazed up, he was getting closer and closer to the men's height. He looked down at his body and noticed that it was clad in armor that was golden. A look to the left saw a 2-headed eagle on the pauldron, and the motif was repeated several more times on various parts of the armor. His gaze fell upon the twins, and he could not feel anything from them except confusion. He had now made his way to those on the right. At their head was a man in blue armor, a laurel wreath atop his head, and a symbol of some kind on his knees, plates and breastplate. Issei felt uncountable pride and respect for this son, the feeling tainted only slightly with the hint of regret and shame. He had quickly seen that regret was the emotion that was shared predominantly between all of them. Just like the left crowd when Issei had looked upon on the right, they spoke their names and achievements in a voice that was now louder than a whisper. It was a hurricane of sound, building to its peak before finally it stopped as the face of a man with the wings of an angel. Issei could not look away at any point during this and was vastly scared when the voice that had been a whisper up until its last form spoke again. This time it was behind him. He jerked in that direction and saw a man his height with the exact same armor and heraldic symbols looking directly at him. His hair was a midnight black and his eyes, just like his armor, was gold. Just like the gold Issei's own eyes would become at points when he was afraid or stressed. His opposite continued his gaze ever forwards. "It's time to wake Issei." He spoke. The voice held the wisdom of a man who had experienced everything, every single path in life a man or woman could tread, known and unknown. Wake, Issei. You are in incredible danger. Do not tarry here and wake. Issei Hayato woke with a jolt. City of Kyoto, Japan, 2003 M3. Hayato residence, 10:20 p.m. Issei's world as he woke was lit with a great and blinding gout of flame. The almost 7-year-old jerked out of his bed in panic. The shelves that held his books were on fire, as were most of the objects in the room. Issei bolted across the room, kicking his door open with such great force that the door flew off its bolts to the wall and slamming it onto the wall across the hallway. The fire was everywhere, nothing was being spared from its wrath. The pictures of Issei and his family that were hanging on the walls were turning into a fine black powder of ash. I need to find my parents. The thought was lightning quick, and Issei was moving before he had finished it down the long hallway to where his parents' room was close to the stairway. He kicked open the door again, sending it flying. He did not question the fact that he could do this. What he found in his parents' bedroom made his stomach sick. The smell was the first thing that hit him. The burnt smell of cooked meat that was polluting the air made him eject the contents of his dinner up his throat and into his mouth. The bile made it past his teeth and onto the floor next the right side of the door frame. The next sight would haunt the 7-year-old for the rest of his life. There on either side of the master bed that had been his parents were the still burning remains of Goro and Miki Hayato. Issei gazed at the man he had looked up to with awe, curled up into a ball on the left side of the bedroom floor with a silent scream of agony still clear on his unburnt face. His mother, the woman who had doted him and had always been his bedrock of support, was also dead. Like her husband, she was curled into a ball, and the same silent scream could be seen on her face. Issei would have made his way to their bodies and tried to carry them out of the inferno, but the voice that had haunted his dream interrupted the attempt. You must flee. Issei shook his head, tears falling to the floor and evaporating into steam. I cannot leave them here. I must try and... The voice interrupted Issei again. If you stay, you die. A pause. Your parents would want you to live, Issei. Flee now, live for them. Issei glanced back at the bodies before with great reluctance fled from the room. Issei ran down the staircase, dodging blocks of the ceiling that were falling. He ran towards the back of the house, not daring to look at what his home was becoming, a place of ash and dust. When he got to the back door, he was horrified to find that the fire had warped the metal doorknob, and he assumed that the rest of the doors in the bottom of the house were in the same condition. He panicked for but a moment before the voice spoke again. Use the closet chair from the table and break the window. Issei did as was instructed, grabbing a chair and with all his strength threw the chair against the window. The move broke the window's glass, the chair having been an old metal one his parents had never gotten around to replacing. Issei moved to the counter and began his climb up. When he reached the top, he saw the jagged pieces of glass that were still in the frame. He hesitated for a second before he launched his small body through the hazard and landed with a grunt on the lawn of the backyard. He booked it towards the trees in the carefully cultivated public land, and with only a second glance back at his home, Issei's innocence died upon the pyre of cruelty and evil that had violently pushed itself out of the dark shadows. The 7-year-old ran and would continue to run long past the horrific explosion that finally broke the ward scheme and turned the black night into a firestorm. City of Kyoto, Japan, 2003 M3. Hayato residence, 10:30 p.m. The house exploded. The fire inside finally hit the sabotaged gas line. The force of the explosion could be felt halfway across the city. Cleria Belil was shocked forward out of her bed by the force of the explosion. She immediately cleared the drowsy mess out of her eyes and ran to her closet and then the dresser, grabbing clothes. She was halfway dressed when the door to her bedroom was blown open by one of her peerage. She tossed a look over her shoulder and saw that it was her queen, a woman with the color of seaweed green hair and pink eyes, medium height and hourglass figure. Cleria snapped a question to her second. What in the name of Lucifer was that? What direction and district did it come from? Being in a high-ranking position in the ratings games of the underworld and devil society had made Cleria and all those in the higher brackets learn quickly and painfully to assess the situation at a quick pace. Actions had to be considered fast and moves needed to be made swiftly, while also gathering more information as the game continued. Her queen had pulled up a magic circle tied into the wards that surrounded the city, and less than a moment later the answer was given. Eastside the city, in one of the middle-class neighborhoods. She paused before continuing. What was one of the middle-class neighborhoods? That made the furiously dressing king stop and pause for but a moment before she continued dressing at an even quicker pace than before. After another 15 seconds, both women ran from the room, and there in the great hall of the mansion that housed Kyoto's unofficial ruler was the rest of her peerage. They were all ready, and with a snap of her fingers their king led them through a magic portal and onto the street closest to the blast zone. That street was 3 blocks away, and the situation there was bad. People were running around aimlessly, shocked awake by the explosion. Pets, children, and adults were running frantically and screaming in terror. Cleria's peerage had to fight its way through the crowds running away from the epicenter. When they finally got there 15 minutes later, it was to a gigantic crater. A block and a half of people who had been just sleeping, unaware of the world outside of their dreams, had all vanished in just a few seconds. Debris was still falling from the sky, slamming into people who were still close to the blast zone. Cleria immediately gave orders for her queen to make a call to the emergency services and then barked to her peerage to stop as many objects as possible from hitting her people. That order was immediately followed without hesitation, and the devils extended from their backs wings that were bat-like. They took to the air and began the upward battle that now faced them. City of Kuo, Japan 2003 M3. 5 hours after the explosion, Cleria's face was drenched in sweat, mud, and grime. The nightmare that had happened tonight was nearing its end. She and her peerage had worked non-stop to try and lend aid to Kuo's emergency services, the heads of which knew that they were receiving aid from the other hidden side of Earth because many of them doubled as people who had signed contracts with Kuo's local devils. A short 5-minute session held with the services heads had led to an agreement that the wall that was supposed to be kept between the two worlds was nullified for the duration of the crisis. Cleria's peerage openly used their powers and specialized skills to work alongside the emergency services. Mind wipes would be applied after this disaster was over. Such agreements between the two sides were actually quite common, and many natural disaster zones where the other side had laid their claws into would receive help from their hidden neighbors. The supernatural world had the two-faced hypocrisy of despising the humans and the effects of humans, but one of the unspoken hidden rules that nearly all who made their home in the supernatural acknowledged as a reality was that they were too deeply connected and dependent on those same things that they hated and looked down upon for their survival. It was why the supernatural powers would try their hardest to crack down on what was their versions of terrorist organizations. The death toll was still being investigated, but the authorities were even at their most optimistic projections were looking at nearing around 1.500 people who were dead. The epicenter had been determined to be in one of the most densely populated areas in the eastern half of Kuo. It was there after 2 hours of searching for survivors and slowly finding but a scant few they had found the source of the explosion. A gas line had been in bad disrepair and a small fire had broken out before spreading to the line, thus leading to the explosion. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented had the maintenance crews for the district simply done their job better. Heads were going to roll, and already Kuo's mayor had promised the panicked residents of his city that there would be consequences for this tremendous failure. Cleria had been present at both Ground Zero and the press conference. This was a night that no one in her peerage would ever forget. Cleria made a small note to get aid from mentalists in the underworld as soon as possible. They had all been traumatized by the events of tonight. The fallout from tonight would create additional problems. The senators that made up the Devil Race's ruling governmental body would be forming a committee to try and see if more could have been done by Cleria and her peerage. It would be a waste of time and resources because her enemies in the Senate would take this opportunity presented to them on a silver platter to try and have her removed from being the one in charge of the city. Territory that was actively controlled by a family from the 72 Pillars was hard to come by. The Great War had made almost all the territory that the nobility had once possessed on Earth to be slowly and steadily abandoned. New territories were being formed now that the pressure from the other two Abrahamic factions had lessened, but the process was extremely slow as the Devils had to get every single major entity in an area ensnared by their ironclad contracts. This lack of a gateway for the Pillars had led to brutal attacks both physically and politically against the few families that had territory left topside. Nothing would come from it. Her cousin Dehauser was the unchallenged emperor of the ratings games, having never been defeated in the mock battles fought to please the masses of the underworld. It was a huge part of the original reason that she had Kuo to begin with. The other major factor being that her family was a support of the Great King's Faction, or GKF, one of the most powerful political parties in Devil Society. The others two parties being the New King's Faction, or NKF, and the now almost extinct Old Satan Faction, OSF. Most of the GKF would continue their support of her rule, but those who were eager for a territorial acquisition would join the NKF and try to have her removed. Cleria sighed again that the politics of the underworld were worse than the humans, mainly because of the fact the players were immortal and had plenty of capital to spare and play with. A rustle from the tent flap drew Cleria away from her thoughts. It was her queen. Sukuri Jong looked every bit as tired as her king. Covered in the same filth, Sukuri had been Cleria's third piece added to her peerage, and there was genuine respect and admiration between the two. Suku, before her reincarnation into a devil, had been an Oni from Japan's yokai population. The queen was someone you did not want to cross. Her already incredible physical strength that an Oni started out with had been increased even further with the queen piece inside her chest. The piece has also given Oni a massive boost in her magical prowess, and she was joking referred to as the spell blade of the setting sun by several of her human pieces. You look like dog shit, my king. Cleria had always appreciated the bluntness that her queen approached life with. If I look like dog shit, Suku, what does that make you look like? Much prettier, dog shit. Cleria held back a great belly laugh that almost popped out of her with a heroic effort. She smiled softly before turning back into a marble statue. You would not just be here to tell good jokes, Suku. What is it? Suku's face hardened before she conjured a spell that was a replica of the magical energy found near the epicenter. I quadruple-checked Ground Zero, my king. It was so faint that for a moment I thought that my eyes were deceiving me. But there were two magical signatures near the zero. One of the sigs was a holy one, and it was clearly an angel with 2 wings. She paused for a second before her face hardened further. The second sig was that of a portal opening and then closing. I could not get a read on whom it belonged to. And before you ask, I had our bishops and my contracted magician look at the sig too. They are equally stumped. Cleria was now incredibly worried now. An angel being that close to the epicenter and a magical portal sig that was nay impossible to narrow down who had conjured it. That was extremely telling that something big had been going on in her territory. Why hadn't the wards she set up around the city not alerted her of an angel's presence? The answers were hidden from sight and probably would be something that would continue the atmosphere of distrust and hatred between devils and heaven. There was one person she knew that would not attack and kill her on sight within the heaven faction. An exorcist that she had met in passing about 2 months ago. The first meet had been rough, but the two had bonded over tea at a local place a town over from Kuo. The conversations had been enjoyable, and the two of them now meet weekly just for being able to enjoy their favorite drink. He was a guy that in another life Cleria could see herself with, however she and he were both happily married. He to a fellow exorcist, that Cleria was often told stories of when they meet, and her to a now dead husband who had fought in the Devil's Civil War. Cleria missed him dearly, and in her moments of melancholy she would visit his grave telling him of her year. The lady of Kuo looked at her queen with serious eyes. Keep investigating this, Suku, you have my unlimited support. Drag anyone else you need in. I'm going to talk to someone who might have information about the angel. Is it that cute exorcist that you meet every week? Suku was the only one in her peerage that knew of the friendship. I am, he might have answers. Suku nodded. I'll keep you updated when we make a breakthrough. Suku left the tent and left Cleria with her own thoughts. Town of Mikikoto, 3 miles east of the city of Kuo. 7 a.m. The golden light of the sun rising hit Issei's face, making one of his eyes squint at the star around which Earth circles. The boy drowsily looking around to see if the sun's rays were entering his bedroom because his mom had come in and seen that he was still fast asleep. That thought made him jolt up, and wiping his eyes he saw that instead of his bedroom he was in an alleyway behind a dumpster. The memories of last night slammed into him like a hurricane. His mom was dead, her silent screaming face looking up from her unseeing eyes to his. That meant his dad was dead too. Issei threw up again the last bits of the dinner last night painting the alley floor. When he was done with the bile, Issei let out a scream, both physical and psychic. The action caused several people in the area surrounding the alleyway to immediately put their hands to their heads to stop a serious migraine from occurring. The scream would have continued longer if not for the voice that had been Issei's silent watcher for his entire life speak. Issei, you must calm down and control your self-emotions. Issei almost instinctively began doing just that, calming his thoughts and feelings. The scream ended, and those affected by it were not left with the migraine that had threatened them moments before. Now it was just a mild headache that could be easily treated. Issei's cries were now whimpering, and feeling as if he was on the brink of madness, yelled out for all to hear. Who are you? The voice was still not speaking for long enough that Issei swore that he was mad now. That belief was proven wrong when it returned. That is an exceptionally long, painful, horrific, and depressing tale. I am the remnant of a once great and powerful man who built an empire out of the ruins of the civilization that had come before, and the man who led my species to ruin. I once held the title of Master of Mankind, Emperor beloved by all, and a million more epithets. Now I am simply one who you can call me as Revelation. Issei saw for a moment the man from his dream. Revelation spoke again. We can unpack this all at a later stage. For now we must find food, water, and clothing for you. Issei nodded duly. He is right, I need those things now that they are gone. Issei got to his feet and slowly made his way from behind the emerald dumpster that had been where the adrenaline had worn off and where his body had finally landed. The boy made his way to the entrance to the alley and peered out onto the sidewalk and street he was on. He did not recognize the place at all. The child looked at the buildings and saw a sign for a bakery. Issei's stomach growled with hunger, but Issei did not have money for food. Revaluation's voice filled Issei's head. I will lend you whatever aid I can, Issei. You are correct, we do not have any money. Do you have any idea how we are going to fix that? Issei shook his head. He did not have a plan. Well, that was not entirely true. There was a way to get the money needed for everything. But it would be wrong. His parents had taught him that stealing was wrong and that it led to nothing but trouble in the here and now and in the future. His stomach growled again, this time louder, and Issei felt as if he was at a crossroads. Revelation stayed silent even though Issei could feel what the spirit thought. Death or compromise. Death or compromise. Issei considered what other paths he could walk forward with. He could go up to an adult and tell them that his family was dead and his home now ash. But his parents had also warned him about strangers. Maybe a police officer or someone else with authority. The more Issei thought about his situation, the less sure he was. Each choice was an avenue of different problems and solutions. His stomach growled and Issei finally made a choice. It disgusted him, but the now was what mattered, not the future. Revelation chuckles inside his head before saying, the future matters too, my son, but I see what you are leaning towards. I'll lend you my aid in anything and everything you intend to do, this I swear. Issei could tell that Revelation was completely serious, but the flash of emotion from the tall man with the wolf pelt on his shoulders said one thing. He is always lying. Issei shook his head, trying to get these feelings that were clearly not his out. Issei then steeled himself and made his way across the street to the bakery. The door opened, the bell onto of it ringing. The woman on duty that morning looked up from the counter expecting a customer. So, it was a major surprise when, upon looking up, she saw that nobody had entered the shop. She shrugged and got back to taking stock. A few minutes later the door opened again, and just like the first time she saw nothing. She had been doing a recount of her bread loves 2 hours later when she realized that according to her last count 3 loves were missing. She recounted again. The count was the same as before. She thought to herself, wondering if perhaps she had been miscounting. She then nodded. That was probably it. She had been awakened violently by her next-door neighbor who had been shouting in the middle of the night that a terrorist had detonated a bomb in nearby Kuo. She had felt something but had almost immediately fallen asleep again. That was probably it. The assistant went back to counting again, putting the incident out of her mind. Issei was running as fast as he could down the street away from the bakery with 3 loaves of bread under his right arm. He was surprised that none of the people who were out and about that morning were not paying attention to what was clear robbery. Revelation supplied the answer. I dampen your psychic presence and your movement. We are all but invisible to people, video recordings, devices, and cameras. That was ridiculous, Issei thought, but it would be useful in protecting himself from those who would do him harm. Eventually, Issei found himself in front of an old worn-down building in a neighborhood that clearly had seen better days. Many of the buildings here were run down, rusted, and in some cases in complete disrepair. Near this old apartment building was a junkyard that was piled high with the trash of humanity's daily lives. Issei cautiously made his way over to the complex and gently opened the door leading into the building. The central hall was absolutely empty of near everything. Out of the corner of his eye, Issei saw a few pieces of furniture that were either rotting away or completely rusted. He slowly made his way up the creaking stairs to the second floor. The hallway here was foiled with atrophied doors who, when Issei touched the knobs, they would usually fall out of their holders. The last door before the stairwell to the third floor was actually in surprisingly good shape, and when the boy touched the knob it would easily open the door, and Issei, despite what Revelation would say about this being suspect, entered the room. The inside of the apartment was still grimy and messy, but it looked livable. Issei was pleasantly surprised when he found running water from the faucet and shower. Despite the good conditions and water, it was truly clear that no one lived here, no clothes or other essentials of life present. So, Issei got to work making this place his own. He put his loves away in the cupboard that was in the kitchen. He then ate 3 slices of the bread and then went to see if there was a bath or shower. He found that there was indeed a shower and that the water was running there too, so the 7-year-old took a short shower, cleaning the dirt and grime he had accumulated from the night before. After he exited the restroom after getting dressed, that Issei finally found a hint of who had lived here. In one of the 2 bedrooms in the apartment were the tattered remains of posters on the wall. Issei could not make out what they had said. He did, however, see that the bedroom had once belonged to a kid. Suddenly, and without warning, things in the bedroom started to change from a decaying state to that of a very clean and well-kept room. On the bed, sitting there smiling, was the shade of a boy looking at Issei, peering into the other boy's soul. He did not say a word, and Issei slowly started to back away towards the door when the boy on the bed released a wave of thoughts and emotions. The primary feeling was sadness tinged with a hint of abandonment by someone. The other feelings were of fear and unease. Before the last was a sense of pure joy. I'm glad you are here. Don't worry about me, I'm long gone, but you are the one that needs this place now. Please use this place, my family, and I wouldn't mind it. The specter gave one last look at Issei before smiling, and then the room returned to its previous state. What the heck was that? Issei was incredibly uneasy with what happened. Revelation answered the question. You are experiencing psychic imprints, the remnants of what people had once felt. They will come oftentimes in areas where things that triggered extreme emotional activities happen. I will teach you how to block them out for the most part and weaken the overwhelming feelings. What am I becoming? Revelation did not seem to want to respond before finally saying, You are going to undergo many changes from this point onwards, Issei, but the short and easy answer, you are becoming like what I eventually became, something far above the rest of our species. I will be here every step of the way. Issei didn't understand what that meant, but a sudden wave of exhaustion hit him full force, and so he made his way to the bed and entered the realm of dreams. Town of Mikikoto, 2007 to 2010 M3. It took 2 months of learning about the new world and its inhabitants before the AI finally decided on what form it would take. After much conversation with its father, the AI holographic image changed from a simple ball of ever-changing colors to the form of a young woman with hair that matched the image of her father. Her eyes were gold, another nod to the one who had brought her into the world. When father had asked what name she would like to be referred to by, the young woman had gone into a state of silence before replying. Dahlia. Dahlia Hyodu. Dahlia had immediately began her work looking through the blueprints father had asked her to build, the beginning of the path to their shared dream. She began the making of many factories within the bunker, each of which would make the many items that would lay the bedrock of what would come. She worked alongside her father in the building of said works, even though she could see that he was young for a human. He worked with dedication that would humble many if they could witness it. By the end of the year, they had built through blood, sweat, and tears, both physically and digitally, the beginnings of the forge. During the construction, Dahlia and her father bonded so closely together that the idea of betrayal of him or the dream would have made Dahlia want to kill whoever would suggest such a course of action in a very gruesome way. Father would always tell her at the end of every day before he would retire to the room they had both decided on after going over the bunker's plans and allocating space to the work, would be his room. I love you, daughter. It was cheesy, but Dahlia would never grow weary of those words. She loved him just as much as he did. When he was sleeping for the 4 hours that were required for him to function properly, Dahlia wandered the internet, both the mundane and the other sides. Father had given her complete control over his spy network of programs, with which she continued the job of collecting information about every possible person, organization, faction, and nation that made up Earth's people. Her feelers had brought to her and Father's attention a report that was made back in 2002 by some devil that supposedly ruled the city of her father's birth. It painted a picture that made neither of them happy, like what Deirdre had sensed the night of the incident were reconfirmed with the report. A magic ward stone had been found at the explosion's heart, along with the magic signature of a portal that had been opened right behind the Hayatu residence. The investigation into the explosion had been strangled by the inability of the devils to find a connection between the ward stone's creator and the apparent sabotage that had been done to the gas main. The report had also contained the numbers of the dead 2,000 souls, gone in a blink. This had shown Dahlia the dark side of the world she had joined, and like Father she swore that things like this would never happen again. Her spies had dug deeper and deeper into the other side's internet, and a nugget of information had been found by the most unlikely of sources. There was a one-off line in a blog that was run by the Yokai of Kyoto of a strange short being who had shark-like teeth who had been in their portion of the city. He had started a bar fight that had turned deadly and had left 3 other patrons dead by improvised weapons. Dahlia would have missed the report, but she homed in on the smile. It was the only thing that had been confirmed about the supposed attackers. So Dahlia followed up on the lead. Later that day, when Father had come into her server room, which was deep in the forge, Dahlia had found an image of her prey. There before them on the picture screen was a short man who, like the report had said, had shark's teeth. Dahlia had enhanced the image until it was somewhat clear, and it was the first potential break that they had found. The reason that the information had never reached the devils was because of how high the tensions between the Yokai and the devils were. The only thing preventing a full-scale pocket war from breaking out between the two rested solely at the feet of Seraphal Leviathan's masterful diplomatic skills. Still, this was something they needed to follow up on. So Dahlia began to attempt to make a paper trail for their suspect. When she was not following the case, Dahlia was busy running their unusual family's wealth, making the green line go up. Numerous businesses were set up in all sectors of the world economy, prepared for the day when their products would reach the general public. That was in the far future, though. Issei had not been idle in his growth during these years. He continued training, pushing his body farther and farther, and with the first of the assembly lines coming online by the middle of 2008, the first thing he had made was a training cage with a dumb Vi that piloted the husk of a robot that Issei was using to practice with. The Vi had been updated with several prominent sword fighting styles, as well as many other types of weapons, and with many diverse types of combat tactics employed by both sides. June 2008. Issei brought the chainsword down onto the right arm of the automata. The blade growled, and as its teeth raked the limb, the blow was quickly followed up on with 2 more strikes aimed at the head and the heart. The husk that was his sparring partner let out a mechanical groan as it struggled to stop the onslaught. The second attack had been blocked by its own weapon, but the third had not. With a roar, the chainsword cut the head off of its user's opponent, and with a loud clack the head hit the floor of Issei's training room. Issei looked at the clock hung on the wall. 5 minutes had passed, 4 minutes too slow. It was noticeable faster, though, than how Issei had first started off on with his combat training, and he had quickly begun developing his own combat style and stances. Issei had opted to go for a shock and awe approach, wanting to end fights that happened as quickly as possible if possible. The chain blade would help in scaring his opponents. It was not of the quality of similar weapons of that time, but it would do for now until an upgrade could be applied to future marks. Issei moved away from the automata and over to a bench where there were bottles of water and towels that would take care of the sweat he always built up during his workouts. Issei caught a glance of his body physique and nodded with approval. He was growing in height and was now taller than the average kid his age and much more muscular. He could pass for someone a year older than his true age. 4 minutes too slow. He grunted so that Dahlia could hear him. His daughter would always observe the spars, looking for mistakes that she would then mention to him after fixing. It's much faster than what your time was even a month ago, father, and leagues better than in January. It's not fast enough, he repeated. How am I to eventually take on our enemies if I can't end the fight before their vastly elongated lives of experience kick in? Dahlia did not know how to answer that in the honesty that was an unspoken rule between them. She instead moved the conversation towards things of which she could speak. I found another hit on our prey. Issei looked at the dais that was where Dahlia projected her avatar. His hair gleamed with sweat, highlighting the red and black that now had joined in with his hair color of birth. Where? The hit was in Johannesburg, South Africa. Another bar fight, and more left dead, 6 this time. Our foe enjoys spilling blood. Issei nodded his head in agreement. This person, whomever they were, was indeed bloodthirsty. The trail that was being mapped by the both of them had shown that the foe would intentionally go to the roughest bars in the city they were visiting just to find the barest hint of an excuse to kill. It was just shown that this thing was a monster in the guise of a person. Issei would compare them to a devotee of the blood god with how much and how often they killed. Keep following, they will slip up, and we will have a name for this ghost. Dahlia nodded. Of course. The room was silent for a moment before Dahlia looked at her father and spoke. I love you. Issei felt most of the tension leave his body, and looking back at her he replied, I love you too. The year continued onwards with more and more moves setting the stage. The money situation was now a true thing of the past. They had enough money to live in comfort and still have enough to get materials for the forge. Training never ceased, with Issei next learning how to shoot various weapons from his own personal arsenal and the weapons that were commonly used by humans. Issei had also begun finding ways to increase his speed, first starting with training weights, and then once that was mastered he began channeling his psychic energy into his body to increase his speed up to what was expected from mid-high class devil and four-winged fallen and pure angels. Also joining on the increased focus on his psychic abilities was modifications to many of the basic abilities that he could have drawn upon. His scream could now stun an opponent and could in theory knock out the weakest of the weak. That was relatively simple in theory, but Issei had not had a chance to test it in action. He will have to think of a way to practice his abilities. The highest point of the year was when Issei had finally achieved balance break on the boosted gear and had begun practicing with it, keeping the effect on for as long as possible before he would eventually fall unconscious. His perpetual state had offset the cost of being in balance break, and while Dahlia had been increasing worried about the exercise, but he had assured her that he was fine. At Dahlia's first birthday arrived, Issei had shown her a project had begun and eventually completed in the old base that he kept as a safe house. Once Dahlia saw the gift, she had wept openly at the beautiful painting of her that her father had made. It had captured her in all the details of someone who had mastered the art of painting, and when she asked father why he done the painting, the answer was profound. I made this so that I do not forget what we are fighting for. We are preparing to fight many wars against beings that would smother the good humans and the other species of our planet can and will make in times of peace. I also made this because regardless of the fact you do not have a physical body yet and do not share my genetics, you are my family, and I will never forget that. The next few years had been more of the same, with Issei and Dahlia continuing with their hunt for the ghost of the night, building up the forge and training. Dahlia had broached the topic of whether they would create more AI, and after a moment of consideration Issei said yes, they would create others, but not now. Now they had to focus on their current goals. Dahlia had nodded, somewhat saddened that there would not be other for whom she could be their older, wiser sister, and for but a single second. She wondered if father really wanted more, before shaking her head to banish that thought away, never to be heard from again. She knew that even though she was here now, father was still lonely, in a moment of weakness that she was sure no one would ever truly see. He had confessed to her that at one point before his family's death, father had come across a word on the internet that had captured his attention. Harem. He had done detailed research in the years since, and he had longed for the dream of a big family. This harem would not be like the ones of the old Ottoman Empire, where the members of it would play games of political and fighting just to get the smallest of an advantage against the others. Father's harem would be a large extended family where all were loved equally. Dahlia had smiled as her father slipped into the realm of dreams after the confession, and had imagined a future where she was with her father in a body of flesh, standing in with her family. Father, when he woke, had asked if he had said something stupid, worried that when he had not been thinking clearly he had said anything that would make her think less of him. She had quickly reassured him that nothing had been said and that she would never topple him from the pedestal he was on, because he had gone forward with something that, with all the evidence of what AI had done to humanity, he had made her. She would not be his Horus. Her father, the ever stoic and always admirable father, had touched her dais and had shaken for but the hint of a moment before saying, "I love you." Dahlia had at that moment made an oath of moment to give to her father, who was sacrificing everything for people he had never met and would most likely never truly know all of them. His happiness and his dreams, so she swore to do everything in her power to make his personal dreams come to life. Because if he was protecting them, who would protect him? Dahlia would be the one. The forge was mostly up and running by the end of 2009. Another year of training till Issei dropped, and Dahlia running the organizational side of the operation. Issei had surprised his daughter again on her birthday with a poem of their first meeting, and Dahlia has smiled so brightly that Issei thought it outshined the light of Sol. The written poem had been placed in Dahlia's server room alongside his painting of her, and they were her most treasured possessions. On the day of his birth, Issei would bring with him a data slate that held a holographic projector that would allow his daughter to visit the graves of their family. There had been next to nothing left of the bodies of Issei's parents and Dahlia's grandparents. It had been that way with most of the victims of Kyo, whose other residents had begun call the incident the Night of Red Flame. Issei had also learned more of what had happened to the other victims of the explosion. He had gathered information about each of the victims' names and lives, refusing to forget them and to always keep their memory alive, because it had been him who the attackers had targeted. The two would kneel next to the gravestones of their family, keeping them clean from the decay of time. Issei had also searched for what had happened to his friends and their families after he had escaped. Akio had lost his father in the explosion, the man being in their home at the time with Akio, and his mother being out late that night grocery shopping. The traffic had saved their lives. Akio had withdrawn into himself with the loss of his first and truest friend, and that loss had been compounded when Irina had moved away with her family to England 6 months after the explosion. Akio's mother had only lasted 2 more years before, in a pit of survivor's guilt and horrifying depression that to her had no way out, had taken her own life. Akio had been given to his father's sister, and it had been she who was now raising him. Apparently the suicide rate for those who had lost someone in the blast and or seen the direct aftermath, such as those from emergency services, had been extremely high. Issei had to fight a battle within himself. The part of him that was still the young boy had wanted to go find Akio and throw himself at his feet, babbling apologies to him for what had happened. The other part of him, influenced by revelation, had told him that the action would probably lead to Akio being ready to kill his friend for all the pain and loss. In the end, Issei had sided with revelation, and in the knowledge that if Akio found out about the other side, he would be easy pickings for anyone who had half an inch of interest in him. And so, Issei had left another part of his past behind him. Issei had been struck with a psychic vision of what the future could have been like. He was with his family all gathered together at a wedding. He could not tell who it was, but many people were there smiling or crying happily. Issei saw that on his left that Akio was there standing proudly in a tuxedo, a smile that spoke of how joyous this occasion was for the groom and an unknown woman who Issei could not see, either of whom clearly were exchanging rings before. Kiss of passion ensued, with crowd clapping ecstatically. When the groom finally turned to face the crowd fully, Issei saw that it was him. It was him, but the him that had not accepted the mantle of master of mankind. His hair was all brown, as were his eyes. Issei choked and was only able to escape the vision thanks to Dahlia sending a bolt of electricity from the data pad into his body. He was weeping on the ground as his daughter gave him comfort. That future was gone. Dust on the winds of time. The here and now were real, and for a moment Issei felt nothing. 2009 to 2010. This year was the first year in which Issei began making contacts. It had started out small. Issei had gone to Kyoto to see if there was someone who could help identify their ghost, and that inquirer had led him to the yokai bar that had served the thing its drink. Issei had entered the bar and slowly made his way over to the counter, taking note of where the exits and windows were along with terrain positions. The waitress at Tengu had shot one look at the human entering the establishment. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and a very small part of the Tengu had entertained the idea of asking for his number before shaking that off. It was not rare for yokai to get together with humans as long they were not from the Japanese clans that represented the families who were the exorcists of Shinto Japan. Still, she continued looking at him with curiosity. Humans that knew of the hidden had only just finally been allowed in the yokai version of Kyoto less than 2 years ago by Lady Isaka. So long as the humans did not try anything funny and respected the locals, they were fine. The man finally stood in front of the bar, and the Tengu turned to face him and asked, "What can I help you with today, sir?" The man's eyes gazed over the drink selection before he said, "Your best sake, please." The Tengu moved to get a cup and alcohol. When she returned with both, she set the containers down in front of her mysterious patron. The man smiled politely and thanked her for the drink, and after having a glass, the woman noticed that there was now a stack of yen in front of her. She raised an eyebrow. "Your payment plus a little more. I am looking for information on a certain person that may have been here a while ago." The Tengu slid the bills into her back pocket and then asked, "Lots of people come through here, human-san, but I'll try, and help might need more to jog my memory." He nodded and slipped more yen over to her. "Who are you looking for, my good sir?" "I'm looking for a certain individual who one of my clients has a very invested interest in finding, a short man with brown hair and shark-like teeth." The waitress froze at the description. "I'm guessing that your client is one of the family of the people that died here a few years ago." A single nod. "My client has very deep pockets and is paying me a lot of money for any information about him." The Tengu looked left and then right and then back to the human. "I might know something. I just do not want him coming back to kill me." Another stack of yen, this one the biggest yet, moved across the counter and it disappeared quickly. "Whomever you're looking for is a nature spurt, probably from the west. Can you narrow it down further? You'd be helping a family find justice and closure, along with getting a dangerous being off the planet." The Tengu thought long and hard before answering. "He was probably from the Aegean. The spirits from the region have a particular presence. I cannot narrow it down further than that." "I am sorry." The human nodded before smiling politely again. "You have been a great help, Tengu-san. This is more information than what I had started with. Have a good day." With that said, the human left, leaving the Tengu to deal with other patrons. Dahlia, on hearing the region had launched the spy bots into the internet servers and kicked the investigation back into high gear. After 2 days of deep surveillance, the ghost that they had been hunting for was finally given a name, dragging him into the light. Their prey's name was Pantier. Pantier was a satyr that had taken into himself the world's anger and hate and then inflicted that upon all those around him. The crimes of which he was responsible for and suspected of had left Issei and Dahlia sick with the body count. They pushed onwards, and with a great amount of effort they finally found another trail that led to the unmasking of Pantier's comrades and his organization. The Goat Man was a member of a very deep cover field team of the Gregoria team, referred to as a PA. The leader, planner, and magical juggernaut was an 8-winged fallen angel. She was not named in the documentation, but she was one of the Gregoria's most competent field agents, and that reflects on her team. Pantier was the frontline warrior of the group, his war scythe a weapon of blood-soaked slaughter. The last member of was a magician with the code name of Argus. The man's file was frankly incredible. He was a master of the arcane, with his greatest talent being the wards he made for Grigori being something close to the standard issue wards for the organization's numerous bases. Issei had also noted that in a few of the documents there were references to a sacred gear user that had personally caught the attention of the Governor General. They both continued digging, and what they found truly shook the Red One. This sacred gear user was the White Dragon Empress. Her name was Valentina Lucifer. Documents pulled directly from the Governor-General told the tale of Issei's rival, and just like him, she had also suffered tremendously in her life. Abused by both her father and grandfather for being a half-breed, Valentina had suffered enough that when Albion had manifested, the girl had taken the chance and had killed several OSF devils before running away from her family, and had been found by a Grigori field team that was loyal to Azazel shortly after. He felt extremely sympathetic to his rival and noticed that she was being called the strongest white dragon past, present, and future already at her current age. Also hidden among the reports was something even more worrying than Timapa. There were incidents of misreporting on wargear, armor, and personnel that were being labeled as dead or missing. Someone in Grigori's high command was fudging information and clearly hiding something big from the rest of leadership. So, Issei started building up more contacts in the underworld, mainly to spy on his first clear enemy in Grigori and also to gather information on the devils. He was quickly able to turn several fallen into being informants, as the nature of Grigori was remarkably similar to the cursed Drukari. Allegiances were traded hourly, and it had taken a great deal of effort to keep his moles loyal to him. Blackmail, favors, and much more kept his new agents in his and Dahlia's pocket, and the amount of effort that came with managing the network was tiring for both of them. The devils had been extremely easy to build a spy ring in. The reincarnated devils heavily outnumbered the pure bloods, but were treated with almost the same amount of distrust and disdain that humans got. The reincarnated were higher up the totem pole, but were still slaves, in many cases hidden behind the veneer of civilization. It was true that some families of the 72 pillars, such as the Gremori, Citri, and the Phoenix, treated their servants and subjects with genuine kindness, but they were a ridiculously small minority. Many of the devils brought into the ring were maids and butlers for the pillars, and despite the oaths of loyalty sworn to their masters, many hated them in the darkest corners of their hearts. So, Issei gave them a way to strike back at their lords and ladies, an avenue of resistance against the system that kept them in chains. So, parts of the board moved in ways the elites could not see. 2010 ended with a spy network that spanned the underworld and was beginning to set up cells in the Yokai, church, magician associations, and surprisingly the network had managed to find 2 pure angels who were disillusioned with how the seraphs were running God's realm. One was a female 6-winged angel who was in charge of running the biggest rest station in Italy, where exorcists were trained for the service in the most high-risk operations in Europe and North Africa. The other was a simple clerk in the record-keeping department in heaven. He only had 2 wings, but he was very observant and made notes of everything that crossed his desk, and had given a few insights into how heaven ran their operations. The Forge had finally completed the first suit of carapace armor and the first lost pistol after Dahlia, and Issei had worked around the bugs of not having the proper equipment and crystals needed for the gun. Thus, the new Mark I lost pistol and carapace armor were not up to the standard specifications of the equipment that the soldiers of the Imperium had used, but it would kill most enemies in 2 to 3 shots, and the armor could resist most of the projectiles and magic spells that were thrown at it. It definitely would not stop spells and weapons that were on the upper ends of the spectrum, but it would do until the next Mark was designed and fixed most of the issues that had become apparent after field tests. The armor was too bulky, having to be made with heavy metals that were substitutes for material that humanity had not yet developed or discovered. That meant Issei was not as flexible as he would have liked, and he would have to tank shots more than dodge. The lost pistol focusing crystal was also a substitute for the weapon that would overheat after 20 shots and vaporize the crystal. Thankfully, the crystals were easily replaceable and cheap to buy in bulk. Still, Issei and Dahlia had enjoyed the year, as now they did not have to divert attention and resources to the inquiries, and the hunt could begin for a pack could begin in full force the next year. During the winter holidays, the family of 2 but really 5 had enjoyed the week off, with Issei not training and Dahlia with only 24% of processing power being used for the Shadow Network and the Forge maintenance. It was a special occasion too, because together as a family project they had worked to make her a physical body, drawing from the database they had found, and then reworked a few body designs that could be made with the current technology and materials. And now, on the day known as Christmas to Christians, they proceeded. The power in the Forge dimmed for 5 minutes before it returned to normal, and in Dahlia's server room with her father and her 2 uncles watching expectantly, Dahlia opened her eyes again. The room, whose colors and details she had seen through the cameras around the Forge and computer screens of the internet, was nothing compared to this moment. Everything was brighter and more vibrant than before Dahlia looked upon the world, and now understood more than ever what it meant to be alive. Yes, she was in a body that did not have skin or blood or most other sensory receptors, but she could feel everything. She looked at her father and stepped towards him. His smile was on full display, and when she stood in front of him, she was only a few inches taller than him. A smile crossed her face, and her father rolled his eyes at the unspoken joke. He brought his hand to her face and spoke without knowing any fear, for she did not yet look entirely human, and spoke. "This is real, and I love you." She replied back to him with a smile that would never die, showing, "For Terra in Excelsior, we shall build this dream of ours together, come whatever, until the stars flicker and die. I know who you are. You are a shadow of great warriors past, a mongrel made out of battlefield leavings. Do not sully this moment by pretending to have a name that is worth remembering, because I surely will not. Come tomorrow." Attributed to name redacted, millennium unknown. Italy, Vatican City, 2010 M2. Irina's entire body was in pain. Another day of training had ended. Her life had been nothing but pain since leaving Kyoto, Japan. Flashback. The pain had begun when she and her family had been awoken forcefully by the shock wave that had come from an enormous explosion. Her mother had held her trying to calm Irina down, and her father had immediately begun to try and find out what had happened. 15 minutes later, the TV had been turned on and the news channel they had opened was reporting that a bomb of some kind had gone off in one of the residential districts of the city. That had almost immediately afterwards been corrected, and it was now a gas main that was in disrepair had suddenly exploded and taken with it 1.5 blocks of houses and apartment buildings. Her father and mother immediately burst into prayer and Irina followed them. None of them had been able to sleep for the rest of the night. School had been cancelled for the rest of the week and Irina had been too scared to leave her mom's side. Her dad, being a pastor for the small Christian community in the city, had immediately rallied members of the congregation to help provide food, clothing, and an exceptionally large chunk of their church budget to aiding survivors. Irina had been in her room when her world had fallen apart. Her father had returned home late that night, exhausted from trying to be a good person. However, instead of greeting her mother and her, Tauji Shido had gone upstairs to the master bedroom, put a blue sock on the door that was meant not to disturb him because of work, and made a call. Half an hour later, he had come down the stairs as the rest of the family was eating dinner and had come up to his daughter and hugged her so tightly that Irina thought he was going to break her back. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Her father kept squeezing her for 5 more minutes without saying anything before he finally replied, "My little saint, I am so very sorry. Daddy, you're scaring me. What is it? Your friend Issei and his family are with the Lord now." Those words had made Irina's blood run colder than the river Styx. "Eyes, hey, he is dead." "Yes, the Hayaru's house was near the center of the explosion last night. I am sorry." Irina had let out a scream that deafened the house. Her mother had immediately gotten to her knees praying to God that he would watch over the souls of their daughter's friends' family. They had been pagans, but no one deserved to get blown to pieces in their very own home. Irina had fled up the stairs still screaming and had locked herself in her room. She would not come out again until 4 days later. Her first friend was dead. The knight in shining armor who had saved her was gone. Her first crush, the future she had imagined where the two of them were married happily together, was now a dead dream. When she had returned to school, she learned that Akio had also suffered from what the people of the city were calling the Night of Red Flame. Akio had lost his dad and had taken the news of their best friend's death even harder. The trauma broke their deep friendship, and when Irina was told by her parents that they were moving to England, she had just nodded along with the decision and followed them. In a way, the move had preserved her sanity. The proximity to old and now bitter memories had lessened considerably after moving to England. She had taken solace in lessons about swordsmanship when she learned that Issei had, as her father put it, been a natural with the blade. So, she had engrossed herself in learning everything she could about swordplay. When she held her sword, she could almost always hear her friend's voice playing back the good memories they had experienced together. It was this dedication to the sword that had led her father to enroll her in the Protestant Church's exorcist school. She had been both amazed and horrified to learn that the Lord had been very real and that things like devils and dragons were also very real. She had jumped into the other side with a dedication that humbled her fellow trainees and the trainers, because she had remembered what Issei had said to her when they had been alone together. "My dream is to protect and help people regardless of where they come from and or what they believe in." So, she had fought for his dream. It had driven a small wedge in her family because of how extreme her parents were about only helping Christians. She remembers the look on Issei's face when they had gotten like that with his and Akio's families. It brought her great shame to know that she had been like that too. The Lord taught humanity to love thy neighbor, and that she had not been doing that. She had changed everything about herself where once she had carried the fanaticism of purity. Now she fought for all humans regardless of their beliefs. Her faith and beliefs had spread to a whole new generation of exorcists, and that had caused an uproar among the higher-ups, but she had kept her faith even when those of the church tried to theologically talk her into accepting their beliefs. She would not budge because her faith was now a fortress of strength and would never be something on which she would compromise. She had been close to being drummed out of the school. Her opponents were powerful, and to her dismay her parents had sided with them against her. The wedge had now become a valley. She had been saved by a surprising source. The great seraph Gabriel had come to speak to her, a lowly pariah nearing the edge of excommunication. Gabriel had told her that she was what exorcists should be, people willing to fight for the good of all children of the Lord. Gabriel had taken her from the school dungeons where she had been held after refusing to change. As they were leaving, Irina had seen her parents. They had been talking to one of the other pastors at the school, and when Gabriel had passed by them with her in tow, her parents had fallen to their knees in reverence to the angel and were greatly shocked to see their estranged daughter with the angel. They had kept walking, and Irina had never looked back. That was 3 years ago. Irina flopped onto her bed because the pain from the training session with her partner had been extra hard today when said partner came into their shared quarters. Her partner was just as tired as Irina. The other part of the team that Gabriel had formed 3 years ago was a young woman with blue hair with a small stripe of green over her right eye. Zenobia Quarta came just like Irina had from a family of the faithful. Irina was a Protestant while Zenobia was a proud Catholic. That had put the team in a small bind primarily by Zenobia, but Irina soon saw why Lady Gabriel had partnered her up with the other teen. It was to make the next wielder of Druendel into a better person. Lady Gabrielle had explained to both of them the ideals of the peace faction of heaven that the lady led. Irina had fallen in love with it. A world of peace where they did not have to kill and destroy, but rather build and cooperate. Irina immediately knelt before the seraph when she had finished explaining their goals, and Irina had sworn her blade and soul to building this dream. Surprisingly, Zenobia had knelt just as quickly, pledging her holy sword to the cause. When Lady Gabrielle had departed to do some paperwork up in heaven, the two young women had looked at each other. It had been the blue-haired teen who had broken the unease. I had heard tales of you, saint of naivete, the exorcist who was willing to accept excommunication and yet continued to follow the Lord in all things. She paused before looking at the brown-haired girl straight in the eyes. The others call you a heretic in all but name, but after the display before me I can say now that they are wrong. You are no heretic but a woman of God, a new Joan of Arc. I would be honored to fight alongside you as teammates. The ice had broken, the wall had cracked and crumbled. They were now the closest of friends, pushing each other to greater heights in the service of God the Almighty. She had found her new family, and that had greatly lessened the pain. City of Kyoto, Japan, 2011 M3. Issei was on the hunt, here in this urban jungle surrounded by the masses of humanity living, breathing, and working each day to move their lives forward in whatever direction they wanted to go in. The secret war that had been brewing in the shadow, the war that would be for the sakes of those around him living lives of blissful ignorance, the war that had been made an undeniable reality nearly a decade ago. The child he had been had transformed into a young man who was nothing but a stranger to those around him. He was hunting for the shadows they would fall eventually. At the beginning of the year, Issei had begun full combat operations. He had entered Kyoto, and after entering the Yokai quarter had begun looking for mercenary work. He was laughed at just like when he had been young and trying to earn money to live off of. It did not discourage him at all, because the skeins of fate had shown themselves to him several paths to an end. The universe, it seemed, loved to cause despair even if the tumors of unreality were not present. He had been in a bar being laughed at again by the locals when a proclamation was made that jolted the locals into silence. Lady Asaka's daughter had been kidnapped. Issei had calmly made his way through the mob of yokai and exited the bar. Once out on the street, Issei let his psychic ability wander through the thoughts and emotions of the city's inhabitants, and he slowly zoomed in on a tiny mind that was shaking in pure fear and terror. He gently touched the soul that was quivering in a filthy, dirty cage located in a dark, forsaken room in some building in Kyoto's heart. The young teenager stiffened and then felt completely and utterly at peace, more so than she had ever felt before. It was almost as if she was in a blanket held closely to her mother's chest, the peace and serenity that the teen had remembered from when she was but a small kid. A voice entered her mind and gently said, "Help is coming. Do not panic and know no fear." Issei followed the psychic trail of Kanu and made his way through the city towards her location. Dahlia was in his armor's voxcaster filling in the details of the building the young teen was held in. It was a 4-story apartment complex that was, for a reason not known to the neighborhood, it resided in empty. No one asked why it was like that, they just accepted it as fact. When Issei got to the building, he immediately noticed the presence of wards that gently made the minds of the mundane accept the building's emptiness. He approached the back entrance and did not see any guards, so he opened the door and entered. Inside the complex it was damp and cold. Issei stretched his senses again and found that his objective was in a 4th basement that was definitely not in the building's official layout. He sees with his gold eyes a door covered in magic symbols, and he makes his way to it. With a psychic battering ram, he blew the door off its hinges and started the descent. He was met halfway down the flight by his first opponent, a medium-height Oni who had went for their katana ready to kill the intruder. The Oni's body fell down the stairs, a hole in its head where a lost shot had carved its way out. The Oni had 2 comrades at the bottom, both Tengu. They looked at the body in shock. It was the last mistake either would ever make. A sound of roaring fury came down on the first Tengu, bisecting the bird in half. The other Tengu looked on in increasing horror and then tried to run. A warp lightning bolt slammed into the retreating Tengu, and its body collapsed to the floor, a smoking hole clear for all to see in the center of mass. Issei walked forward past the newly made corpses, not looking at them. Thus, he continued butchering yokai as he went. They were just foot soldiers, nothing special about them. The only warrior he had a hint of trouble with was a female Tengu that was wearing the official guard uniform of Lady Asaka's people. Issei knew already who had planned this kidnapping. A large number of yokai in Kyoto were unhappy with the progressive policies the Asaka had been advocating for in the past 25 years, and the resentment had slowly built up and then boiled over earlier today. The Tengu lunged forward, her blade going for a quick and clean kill that would stop this rescuer in their tracks, the blade being Tengu steel, further enhanced by her magic. The blade was parried by the growling weapon of her opponent, and just as she was preparing to make another strike, the left hand of the intruder came up with a weird gun of all things. There was a snap hiss by the gun, and the Tengu warrior fell to the ground, a clean shot made against her head. The red light had punched through the helm she had been wearing, and as Issei passed her body, the part of her face that still looked like a face was in clear shock. Thus, the carnage continued down the next flight of stairs and level. Halfway to Kanu, Issei had continued forward, never once knowing fear. It had been near the room in front of Kanu's holding cell that Issei met the commander of this group. He was a massive Tengu garbed in the armor of Yasaka's personal guard. his feathers gray with age, his eyes were a piercing black that bore holes of hate at Issei. The Tengu drew a naginata, and marking him a clear veteran of war, he did not make small talk, rather he attacked. The spear blade lunged, and Issei immediately parried the blow. Another strike followed, and this time the blade made contact with Issei's right pauldron. A look of triumph in the bird's eyes turned to surprise when the spear did not cut through the rescuer's armor and claimed a limb. The bird's surprise was pressed onto by Issei. The chainsword roared in glee for blood, and it was only the Tengu's age and combat experience that saved his life. Instead, he only lost 3 fingers on his left hand. Blood gushed from the wound, painting the floor blue. The Tengu, in retaliation for the injury, increased his speed with magic. Blow after blow from both warriors were exchanged, neither giving the slightest hint of mercy. The blood has stopped flowing from the Tengu, and he, despite his age and wound, was not tiring. The duel continues. Another strike hit Issei's leg. This time the naginata cut into the carapace, legging if ever so slightly. Issei then used his checkmate. Drawing on the Sea of Souls, Issei drew forth from the warp a lightning storm that hit the Tengu full force, sending him flying into the wall as electricity danced across his body. Issei followed up on the move with a chop that took the Tengu's hands. The bird slid down the wall into the floor. He was broken and defeated. The old Tengu looked into the green eyes of his foe's helm, and seeing the end, tiredly sighed and spoke. "Make it quick. Let me die with honor." Issei looked at the bird before giving the slightest of nods. The chainsword cut the warrior's head off. Kanu was scared. She had had lots of loud noises coming from the room in front of her, and while it was not the crippling anxiety and fear from before she was frightened, was this the man whose voice had calmed her down? Or was this the start of a new nightmare? The door opened and a tall figure entered the room. On his hip was a strange gun, and on his back was a sword, though the teen Kitsune could not see or make a hint of it. The man's face was covered by a helm with glowing green eyes that scared Kanu. Before the figure made its way forward towards her, she took a step back and recoiled. This person was going to hurt her, she knew it. Where was the one who had promised to save her? Nothing happened until Kanu opened her eyes again, and what she saw, she could only describe the face on the figure before her as perfect. His face was carved in such a way that it seemed to be made from marble. He was handsome to a level that Kanu would never have thought possible for a human. His golden eyes held such vast and deep life experience that Kanu could have asked him about anything and received a meaningful answer. Art, philosophy, gardening, and every other art form she could imagine he was a master in. There was nothing but kindness in those eyes. He was looking at her as if she were the center of the universe and he its defender. He was her hero, her knight in armor that glowed golden like his eyes. He was the one that spoke and calmed her. Kanu lived 1,000,000 lives, and in all of them he was there. He had won her over, and he had yet to speak physically. He would always come to save her. He could be anything she wanted him to be. The cool older brother, the doting father, the most perfect of husbands. Kanu liked the last one a lot. He unlocked her cage door with a single shot of red light. It fell to the floor with a clang of metal on concrete. The cage opened and her hero extended his hand to hers. His voice was more beautiful than any singer Kanu had ever heard or would ever hear. "I said help was coming, my lady. I am here now, and I will get you back to your mother." Her heart sang with those words, and remembering the other words he had said, she knew no fear. She would never let fear back into her soul, just like her savior. "Thank you." His smile was bright and pure. "With your permission, my lady, I would like to put you under a sleeping spell. I promise to take it off as soon as we leave the building." She trusted him and could correctly guess that he was trying to preserve her innocence for just a bit longer. "All right, I do have a question for you, my knight. What is your name?" "Issei, my lady. My name is Issei." Kanu awoke to the sounds of the city. It was just like always noisy. She took comfort in that noise. Her savior was sitting next to her resting body. To her immense disappointment, the helm was back over his head. He gentlemanly helped her up, and so together they made their way out of the alley behind the building that had been her prison. As they walked amongst the evening crowds, Kanu noticed her rescuer was not attracting the attention of the crowds, despite the fact that he was still in his armor. "I am making sure we are not seen. My lady, I do not know if there are unseen watchers looking for you that are in the crowds. Better safe than sorry." Kanu nodded. That made a lot of sense, but he had dodged the question. But the Kitsune wanted to return home more than have it answered. They continued moving towards the way portal that led to the Yokai half of Kyoto, and with whatever power Issei had, they were not bothered by anyone. While walking, Kanu asked her rescuer a couple more questions, mainly what kind of armor and weapons he was using. The human gave non-committal answers, and it was only when she had asked on a whim what his favorite type of books were that he finally gave a truly clear answer. "I have always enjoyed science fiction novels. The worlds they build are much like the hidden world. They are incredible and awe-inspiring." When they had gotten into the other half of Kyoto, Issei had actually gotten more on guard, watching more intently for dangers that would threaten her. His strange ability seemed to hold up, and he only dropped it when they were next door to Yasaka's palace. They had continued walking until they reached the front gate, where guards had noticed them in 10 seconds, and upon seeing Kanu with a strange armored figure, charged forward to rescue the young woman. Issei had simply let them come and surround him before the captain, on seeing an elephant Yokai, could give the order to arrest this stranger. Kanu had stopped them, declaring loudly that this man had saved her from her abductors. The captain looked to the Kitsune and then to the stranger before nodding. Issei was put in the middle of an escort of 5 guards that kept him in a circle that would protect Yasaka and Kanu from any attack he might launch. When they reached the throne room of Yasaka's court, 20 more guards were stationed and ready for a fight. Sitting on a wonderfully sculpted wood throne was the 9-tailed fox, mistress of the yokai of Japan. Yasaka was a tall, beautiful woman with flowing blonde hair that reached to the middle of her back, out of which swayed 9 foxtails. Her clothes were painstakingly woven in light gold and red colors that went well together. On her head was a simple crown with a rising sun motif set in the center of a small circle of rubies. When the woman saw her daughter again for the first time in 7 hours, she broke courtly decorum and ran to her daughter, her tails bouncing with excitement. The 9 tails hugged her daughter, not letting her go, fearing that if she did, Kanu would disappear. When the reunion was over 20 minutes later, Yasaka let go of her daughter and turned to her guards and the stranger. Making a very educative guess, Yasaka gestured to her guards to let her get a look at her daughter's rescuer. He was tall, around 6'2". His face was protected by a helm with glowing green eyes, with the rest of the armor looking like that of a bug's chitin. He carried a pistol of unknown make and model and a sword on his back that was very alien to look at. After finishing her glance, Yasaka finally spoke. "You have my deepest gratitude, warrior, for bringing my daughter back to me. If there is any way for me to repay this debt, you need only ask." The man surprised all of those assembled when his voice filtered by a scrambler that would make it harder for one to properly identify him. "I seek no boon, Lady Yasaka. There is no debt between us. I found your daughter not for honor, glory, recognition, or reward. I did so to prevent grief for you both, because I would be a lesser man if I had sat by and done nothing." Yasaka and her retinue were in complete shock at the statement. Everyone always wanted something. To think that this human wanted nothing from beings who were above him in the pecking order was unimaginable. "Are you certain, stranger? I am willing to grant almost anything you could ever desire. Information, money, a position at my court with some influence." The man only shook his head. "I acknowledge no debt between us, my lady. But if you continue to insist to give reward for my deed, then let that action be an oath of friendship between us and no more." That was what he wanted. Friendship, not anything else. What sort of friendship was he asking for? Seeing her confusion at his words, the stranger clarified. "Oaths as you would give to a friend of the hearth. I ask for nothing more. I will, however, be open and honest and inform you here and now that if you see and hear cases of my appearance, it means I am hunting the foes who hide in shadows, those who prey on humanity, and yokai alike, even if they wear the same faces." The guards bristled at the suggestion that their lady would ever do such an action as he was implying. Blades on their sides were gripped now more tightly. Kanu had wanted to say something, anything to calm their anger. Yasaka, however, with her several centuries of life in politics, could see the intentions of the stranger a bit more clearly. It seemed that the stranger had assumed the mantle of a protector. He acknowledged that her people were just that, people, not humans whom he seemed to be extra protective of, but people all the same. "This could work. Very well, stranger. I freely and knowingly, of my own free will, swear to consider you a friend of my house and its members, to share my food and drink with you freely, for I to consider your worries and troubles, and for you to know that you can call me and mine your friend." The stranger nodded in acceptance at the oath before returning it with one of his own. Pulling from a pouch on his waistband several scrolls, he then proceeded to hand them to Yasaka. "Then, in the interest of true friends, my lady, I give to you these. They were on several of the abductors, and I believe they should be of use to you." Yasaka took the offering and gave all but one of the scrolls to her personal champion, an Oni who had been as still as a statue, who was standing to her right. The 9-tailed fox then opened the scroll and began reading. Almost immediately, the killing intent that was coming from the monarch made 3 of the weakest guards faint, as they could not take the pressure the intent was putting into the room. The other 17 guards were sweating profusely. Kanu was shaking, having only felt this once before. The teenager looked at her knight again and saw no trembling. No fear." The word echoed again, and thus Kanu straightened her back and once again knew no fear. This is outrageous and disgusting." "Kombucha, yes, my queen. You are to take the 15 here and gather more of our most trusted people and hunt for rats." Yasaka threw a fireball at 2 guards behind her in but a moment. The 2 Tengus had been taken aback by the suddenness of the attack and were immolated. The rest of the guards looked terrified now by the violence before Yasaka's eyes met theirs. "They were traitors to my house, breaking the oaths they had given to me. The rest of you are lucky that your names are not on this list, written in the hand of my remarkably close and once trusted seneschal. You will help my champion find all these traitors, and if I catch even a hint of treachery from any of you, then you will be put to the sword. Am I clear?" The guards nodded up and down quickly while still trembling. "Good, now get to work." The 15 guards moved with the champion, and they began the grim hunt that would start in the palace but soon extended to every single department and service with how far this rot had spread. Yasaka looked at the stranger before bowing low to them. "You must take oaths of loyalty seriously, as you should, stranger. I thank you for honoring your oath and for helping expose this conspiracy." The stranger nodded once more before his voice said, "I have known and have paid the price from those who broke their oaths." Yasaka looked at her new and unlikely ally critically, and even though the armor he wore was alien in design, she could see he was telling the truth. True friends should know the other's name and face, stranger. Remove your helm and speak your name. And so, Issei did. Issei had, after the Day of Feathers, as the kidnapping had become known by, jumped onto the radar of the supernatural world. Work came frequently, which led to increased combat, refining his skills in war. Isaka would often give him work, going after yokai who had broken her decrees. The fury he brought to each and every job, always completing what was asked of him, had deepened the relationship between the two to what had been sworn in her hall that day: true friends. Job after job, fight after fight, and soon other factions began approaching the one that was becoming known as the Red Angel. The name was ironic in the extreme, but Issei had allowed its use to give the forgotten son who had previously bore that epithet some recognition and redemption, for instead of mindless genocide and slaughter, the name was becoming something that was spoken in admiration and respect by those of light and a dread monstrosity of those in the dark. Saving the young princess of the yokai had been the primary objective of his first combat mission. The second had been for documents he had known were at the prison. The rebels had support from Issei and several other groups. It had been with this information in hand that had led him to a possible location for Pantier. The satyr was going to be visiting Kyo sometime next year for an unknown reason that was probably not good. The scrolls had also pointed him in the direction of several possible associates of Issei who had made rat holes for the group, and Issei was determined to exterminate these strongholds in Japan. The first selected fortress was in a town almost an hour away from Kyoto, and it would be there he would topple the dominoes. Town of Hagi, Japan, 2011 M2. Night had fallen over the town of Hagi, and its people were beginning to start the transition into sleep. It had been a regular day here, nothing special had happened, and most of the population would continue to want that state to continue. Near the center of the town was an old, abandoned sanitarium from the early part of the last century, and it was a stark contrast between how the people of the past had treated each other and how life had somewhat improved in the now. The town's population did not know, however, that the sanitarium held new monsters who wanted to send them all back to the Stone Age at best, and at worst sought their total annihilation. A small portal opened in an alleyway near the decrepit structure, and from it came a shadow in armor. The figure slowly made his way to the old building and observed the ward set up around it, focusing on what would be to those trained in the art a small, barely seen crack. Issei put psychic pressure on this crack and broke open a small doorway into the grounds of the building. It was fate that had played into Issei's hands this time, as fortunately for him one of the previous users of the boosted gear had been a very competent warder, not a master like Argus, but one who had been skilled in the finding and breaking of wards. That echo of a man had, thanks to D-Drake, been able to share his knowledge and pass along his work. Issei entered the sanitarium and began looking for blood. At the entrance to the first holding cells were two figures, both wearing skimpy clothes and both looking extremely bored. They died in half a minute. The first from a shot from a new weapon in the intruder's ever-growing arsenal. The first fallen angel heard a crack, and then a second later she exploded in a shower of gore and sinew. The second fallen had looked to her comrade's death, and before she could react, a roar echoed through the hall, and the last thing she would see would be wings of red and gold coming towards her at a speed that made terror the last emotion that she would ever feel, her eyes looking at her killer from the ground, unblinking and white. The door opened and several heads turned to see who entered. A noise-dampening ward was on the outside of the walls of this block, otherwise those heads would have been raised in alarm at the noises they would have heard. 3 of the 7 beings in the room died in 10 seconds, their bodily fluids and hints of bones flying outwards from where the bodies had been after a trio of bangs. The other 4 others immediately sprang from sitting or resting positions and attacked their comrade's killer. Another bang and a 4th joined the abyss as they closed in. The growl of the enemy's sword took another as the blade parried a light spear and then returned the strike, sawing its way through the left side of body. And that fallen fell apart. Another bang and the leg of the 6th was blown to pieces and sent the male fallen toppled to the ground screaming. The 7th fallen tried to run, but she was cooked alive by a blast of lightning that had come from the chainsword, and her body fell to the ground. The fallen without a leg was whimpering, and having released his bowels in fear was now trying to crawl away from this red angel of death. The angel touched his head, and after a moment the skull popped. Issei would not remember their names even as he heard their last thoughts. The death dealing continued unabated, block after block, with bodies of fallen angels, renegade yokai, exiled exorcists, and magicians all being sent screaming into the warp. They all fell to the red angel. The forces inside the building began running from the single being who was carving his way through them like a hot knife through butter. Some began gathering in large numbers, hoping to use their numbers against him. It did not save them. Others tried to activate portals and found that the attacker had, while he was slaughtering them, also changed the wards, preventing them from running. Those died too, inside the office, which was where the control center for the operation. 3 fallen angels and the remaining exorcists that were employed here had been barricading the door to try and keep their soon-to-be killer out. 2 of the fallen were 4-winged, both male, who were, compared to many fallen angels, actually were equipped with armor that had come with them when they fell. It was excellent quality armor, and both were silently sending prayers to God that it would be enough to at least give them a chance to find a way around the murder machine coming their way. The sole female among the fallen was a 6-winged magic-type fighter. Her arms were preparing a complex holy spell that she hoped would, when the barricades failed them, slam headfirst into the demon. The 4 exorcists were shaking, and 2 were crying out open prayers to God to save them. 1 had broken down and was in the corner of the room in a fetal position, trying to appear as no threatening as possible. The last was a white-haired man with a bloodthirsty grin of excitement spreading over his face that spoke of insanity. The door and the desks that had been holding back the carnage were blown open in less than a second as a wave of energy swept into the room and had various effects on the occupants. One of the praying humans felt the energy and began vomiting up the contents of his stomach. The other praying exorcist was now screaming his prayers out as loud as his voice could to give himself courage. The bloodthirsty one was panting loudly with excitement while the fallen were filled with a wave of disgust that was directed towards them. The female fallen let loose her spell. The projectile hit the thing head-on and threw the figure backwards and onto the ground with such force that the hint of hope the action brought to the remaining terrorists was the most sweetest thing they had each tasted in the long or normal lives. Except for the white-haired maniac whose eyes now held such great disappointment, his night had been ruined. The shout of victory that the others had been about to release died unceremoniously as the intruder got up from the floor and after dusting himself off, moved forward again. The scream his sword let out made the violent, sick exorcist shit his pants in the renewed fear the figure surviving a spell that would have killed low high-class beings horrified the defenders. Then the Grim Reaper attacked. The crack that had begun to echo in the minds of the victims slammed into the courageous priest and his body disintegrated into a red mist. The fallen launched spells in retaliation, each hitting the slowly advancing juggernaut. None scratched him and he moved ever forward. Another crack and one of the male fallen joined the exorcist in death. The sound of a click told the remaining fallen and humans that there was no more ammo in that abomination of a gun. So, the giant closed the distance and slammed into the scared shitless priest. The chainsword took both legs of that one and then his head rolled onto the floor. While the fallen were looking at the thing in ever-growing horror, the opposite was going through the mind of Fried Selzin. This was no human, or any regular creature born from simple stock. This was a god of war, a being who was bringing his art to the battlefield with strokes that were awe-inspiring and praiseworthy. Oh, how he wished that he had met this one before his excommunication and before he had signed on with the pathetic fallen angels, because this god would have led him to heights of war that would please his black soul. The sword came down again, this time on the fallen angel mage. 2 sets of wings on her right side were cleaved off cleanly through feather and bone. The fallen let out a scream and threw more spells, each landing despite the pain. The male fallen charged and forward slammed his light spear into the guts of the monster and was more horrified to see that it only left dents and did not pierce it. The fallen one lost his arms and then took a stab directly through the heart. His body crumpled to the floor. Fried finally made his move and brought his light sword into the god's body. The sword left only a scratch on the armor where the kidney that he had been aiming for was. Fried lost the hand that held the sword but returned fired with his light bullet revolver, enjoying the fight immensely despite losing his hand. The bullet ricocheted off the helm, leaving only a small dent, before the god's glowing eyes fell on the young priest. A second passed before the giant slapped Fried, sending him into the wall, and then slowly fell to the floor, either unconscious or dead. The fallen did not know which. She summoned all of her strength and made a light spear before re-entering combat. The blows from both hit with such intensity and speed from both that a human would not be able to keep up with the exchange. The spear hit and stabbed into its opponent, trying with the fury born from desperation and the drive to live that all sentient beings have. It was never enough. Her enemy's armor was too strong and too thick. All she left on its surface were the slights of dents and a few holes that had almost made the beginning of progress that might have, if she had more time and energy, finally been able to kill this man. The fight ended abruptly when the sword parried her spear and then followed that, opening up with another slice at her wings. Most of the pairs on her left fell to the ground and the pain overwhelmed her. She dropped to her knees and, looking up into the eyes of her soon-to-be murderer, she saw the blade teeth covered in blood from earlier kills and her own come down. Issei turned away from the angel and looked to the corner where the final exorcist was still in the corner, hysterically crying, curled up. He approached her and was about to end her sad existence when her thoughts hit him full force. He saw a little girl looking up into the face of a nameless priest as he carried out unspeakable acts. He saw the young woman who had once dreamed of being a doctor, who had wanted to make the world a truly better place for all people. Look forward to each day as another personal life in hell, forced into the service of a church that allowed wolves in sheep's clothing to abuse their flocks. He saw a woman that, when enough had finally been enough, had taken a stand against the establishment and was punished with more torture and suffering before being thrown out to the streets to die. He saw a wonderful nun whose heart was the purest thing he had ever seen in his life find this broken husk of a human being, and had, without questioning what or who this was, tried to put this exorcist back together. She had successfully done about as much as she could physically. The scars on the mind, the nun, however, could not fix easily and or without significant effort. This nun, who even Revelation would agree should be called a saint, whose faith was what faith should be, instead of the shit and evil that would too often takes form. This saint had helped the woman and then helped her escape from that life forever. But where could this newly freed woman go? She had no money or life experience other than mindless service, did she? And it had been with terror-inducing reluctance that she had entered this cotter of fallen angels' service. She had hated every single second of service, especially when it became all too clear that this cotter served darkness and was hurting the people the woman had once defended. Her breakdown in the room had come from all this and his rampage. Sympathy and regret filled Issei for this woman. The rest of the cotter had been pure evil and had needed to be destroyed for the betterment of all. This woman had embraced the fear in the end. He came to a decision. I shall know no fear, and you are worth remembering. The portal opened and 3 individuals passed through it, and another dawn rose over the town of Hagi. Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.